Hey dreamers, welcome back. Cozy up, hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more bedtime stories. Drop your location and time below. Take a deep breath. And let's begin.
I never believed something could live behind these walls until I heard it call my name in the dark. Every night, after the world outside had slipped beneath its shallow moonlit sleep, I lay awake in my bedroom, straining to will my eyelids to close. It began as a soft scuttling, like insects feeding on rot. I told myself it was mice, always mice. I pictured them darting through voids between plaster and lath, their tiny teeth gnawing at the building's aging bones. But no matter how many traps I set, no bodies ever turned up. No chewed bodies, no lifeless forms to confirm my suspicions. Only silence until the scratching resumed. The first time I woke to a whisper, I froze mid-breath, convinced I'd slipped across the border into another realm. A faint voice, so soft I almost doubted my own ears, murmured, "Can you hear me?" It was impossible to tell where it came from, left wall, right wall, ceiling, closet. The darkness swallowed direction. My heart thundered so loudly I thought the entire house must tremble. When I dared to speak, my own voice sounded alien. "Who's there?" I croaked. No answer. Just the scratch, 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 like claws dragging across wood. Night after night, the sounds grew bolder. The first few nights, I blamed fatigue. The next week, I moved my reading lamp closer, thinking the beam would banish phantom noises. Instead, each glow of light seemed to embolden them. Scratches became taps, taps became thumps, thumps became heavy breathing, low rasping that echoed inside my skull. I started wearing earplugs, piled pillows over my head, pressed my palms so hard to my ears I thought I'd crush myself. Still, I heard it, a wet, deliberate rasp that slithered inside my mind. Driven half mad by exhaustion, I bought a drill. Even in my haze, I reasoned. If I bored holes through the plaster, I'd either glimpse a nest of rodents or prove to myself there was nothing supernatural here. Late one night, I shoved the drill's bit against the wallpapered wall beside my bed and pressed the trigger. The drill groaned to life, spinning as I pushed forward. Suddenly, a stifled gasp echoed through the bit, rattling the tool in my hands. It sounded absurd, like breathing into a straw. I jerked back, yanked the drill free, and the wall fell silent except for my own ragged breathing. By morning, I found my hands shaking. I couldn't tell whether I'd hurt an animal or a monster. Colleagues at the office noticed dark circles under my eyes. I smiled wanly and blamed insomnia. But I started to dread dusk the way one dreads a train wreck about to happen. After dinner, I lay in bed, feigning sleep even as I awaited the first sign. And always, within an hour of the streetlights flickering on, I heard it begin. I tried reasoning with it, speaking softly into the plaster. "What do you want?" I whispered through the wall. I imagined my voice pushing through plaster, wood, and lath, reaching a small hidden chamber. For weeks, there was no reply. Then, one night, a single word floated back, "Home, home." My skin prickled. The house I'd moved into less than a year ago was hardly home. I rented, after all, an old Victorian remodeled into apartments. I'd never met the other tenants, and the landlord lived 3 states away. Yet that night, I sat bolt upright, heart hammering, as if I'd awoken in my childhood bedroom. "I'm not your home," I whispered fiercely. "This is just an apartment." "Silence!" I cursed myself for speaking aloud. The neighbors would question me. I needed proof. I decided, in some perverse sense, to catch it. I set up a digital voice recorder on a nightstand pointed at the wall. I wrapped it in a scarf to muffle any click of buttons. When the scratching began, I hit record. The next morning, I crept in to retrieve the device, certain I'd captured something. Instead, the recorder was gone. No sign of it on the floor, No battery compartment opened or batteries missing, just gone. I searched the room in a panic, convinced it had dragged the recorder into the wall. After an hour, I found it tucked behind a book in my old leather armchair, screen cracked and smeared with something dark I refused to examine. Sleep was impossible after that. I began keeping a notebook on my bedside table. Every sound, every whisper, every thump I jotted down with trembling hands, along with timestamps. Yet tomorrow morning, whenever I glanced at the page, the times were smudged, the ink blurred, as though wet, and the writing illegible. I accused myself of dreaming it, ink bleeding in my sleep. I vowed to switch to pencil, but pencils shattered, snapped in two, or vanished entirely. On the seventh night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, flashlight in one hand, my father's old hunting knife in the other. I ripped at a corner of wallpaper, tearing carefully so I could replace it later, revealing a patch of bare plaster. I waited, willing the darkness to breathe. And then I heard it. A scratching, soft at first, then jolting, frantic. I pressed my ear to the plaster, the flashlight's trembling beam illuminating dust motes. The breath that exhaled against my ear was cold, oily, as if something had crawled out of my nightmares. "Help me," it rasped. I slammed my hand over my mouth, yanked back the knife. My grip tightened until the handle bit into my palm. I glanced around the room, the door, the closet, the ceiling fan, anywhere something could have moved. But I was alone. The knife fell, clattering to the floor, and the voice ended with a single, pained sob. I should have run then. Anything to escape those walls. But something held me there. Pity, curiosity, madness, perhaps all three. I tried to piece together a narrative. Whoever, or whatever, lived here had been trapped, maybe for decades, perhaps since the house was built. The wallpaper's pattern was old, curling at the edges. It hinted at layers beneath layers, painted over countless times. I thought of the house history, rumors of a child who disappeared in the 1920s, of secret passages and hidden rooms left behind by drunken servants. It seemed too perfect. I started tearing at more wallpaper, section by section, until I uncovered a faint outline of a door drawn in cramped scratches. It was small, barely a foot tall, etched into the plaster. Beneath it, someone had scratched a date, 10th October 2030. Over it, one name, Evelyn. My chest tightened. I remembered reading about a young girl named Evelyn who vanished in 1930, her parents blaming her flighty imagination when she spoke of another family living inside the walls. They claimed she wandered away, never to return. Her case went cold. The house eventually sold, repainted, renovated, but the house stayed. She never came home. My breath caught. I ran to my laptop and searched Evelyn Wall's 1930 disappearance. The first result was a forum post from a local history enthusiast. He wrote that the house had a hidden dollhouse replica built for Evelyn by her father, down to the smallest detail. When Evelyn stopped speaking, he died of heartbreak. No one ever found the dollhouse. Some believed Evelyn, an only child, wandered into a secret passage and was never rescued. The house stood abandoned for years after. I stared at the photo in the post, a peeling wallpaper that matched mine exactly. I sank to the floor, mind racing. It couldn't be coincidence. The scratching continued outside my apartment too, in the bedrooms of other tenants, always dismissed as plumbing or settling pipes. None of them reported whispers or voices though. Why had it chosen me? I felt a pang of guilt. How many nights had Evelyn waited for someone to find her door? For someone to let her out? My insomnia transformed into dread. I barely ate. I haunted the edges of wakefulness, eyes fixed on the walls. When morning came, I washed out my mouth and told my reflection to hold up until tomorrow. My reflection didn't answer. On the 10th night, there was thunder, and rain battered the windows. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm. For the first time, the voices beneath the plaster paused, as though the presence behind them was watching, waiting. Then came a hard knock, 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 swift and regular, as if someone rapping from the other side. It grew faster, tap, 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 until it turned into a furious pound. My entire body twitched with each impact. I sat up. The lamp flickered. I grabbed my father's knife and approached the wall where Evelyn's door had once been sketched. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the knife. I pressed my palm against the damp plaster. The pounding ceased. In the silence, I thought I heard a sob that shook the floorboards. "Evelyn?" I whispered. "I'm here." The wall temperature shifted. Where my hand pressed, the plaster felt soft like damp clay. My fingers sank into it. I gasped and withdrew it. Smears of pale plasticine clung to my skin. I looked closer. The plaster was breathing, pulsing, as if alive. The ridges of Evelyn's door reappeared, freshly carved, deeper than before, and below it was not one date, but two. 10th October 2030, and tonight's date, tonight, the 10th anniversary of my moving in. In 5 years, on this same date, she would open the door herself. My heart hammered. I stumbled backwards, slashed at the air with the knife, as if threatening a phantom. The plaster smoothed out behind my back, erasing the door. But I heard it, a gentle click, like a lock unlatching. And then, just beyond the wall, something moved. I could almost see the hinge turning. My breath left me in a ragged gasp. I bolted for the window, flung it open, and lunged onto the fire escape. Rain sluiced down my hair. I stared back at the apartment window, revulsion knotting my stomach. Whatever was behind those walls, whatever was Evelyn, would be waiting for me when I returned. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the fire escape until dawn, cold and soaked. I could still hear the soft scratching from within my own skull, an echo of the voice that called my name. When the building manager finally found me at sunrise, I barely heard his questions. I handed him my keys and left without looking back. 2 days have passed since I moved into a new place. It's smaller, newer construction, drywall, metal studs, no lath or plaster, or so I thought. I taped the seams and painted over every wall by daylight. No more peeling wallpaper, no more hidden doors. The echoes of Evelyn's voice still haunt me in the quiet hours before sleep. I'm terrified that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, I'll hear that same click from behind a wall that should be solid. I'm terrified she'll come back and find there's no place for her anymore. But sometimes, in the silence, I swear I feel nails scratching at the back of my head, as though Evelyn is right behind me, desperate to be seen, desperate to go home. And I have nowhere left to run. I never believed in ghosts until I saw her standing right behind me in the mirror, fractured moonlight outlining her rib-thin frame and eyes wide with horror. I had moved into the old Edwardian townhouse 2 months ago, charmed by its tall ceilings, stained glass windows, and the antique oval mirror hanging above the fireplace in the parlor. From the moment I unpacked, the mirror fascinated me. It was too ornate to be modern, its gilded frame carved with twisting vines and half-hidden faces that seemed to leer when I wasn't looking directly at them. My friends joked that it looked like a portal, but I laughed it off. After all, I wasn't the kind to lie awake at night, worried about demons. That changed on the 3rd night after daylight savings time. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from moving boxes and scrubbing years of dust from every molding. At exactly 2:37 a.m., my eyes fluttered open. The house was silent. I rolled over, reached for the lamp on my nightstand, and froze. Reflected in the hallway mirror at the foot of my bed was someone else, a pale, frail woman draped in what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair tangled and matted. She stood motionless, as if carved from smoke. My pulse thundered against my ribs. 1,000 thoughts slammed through me at once. An intruder, sleep paralysis, a hallucination. I blinked and she was gone. I convinced myself it was exhaustion. Desk deep in paperwork, I chided myself. Logical explanation, overwork, shadows. I stopped sleeping with the hallway light off, leaving a soft glow that banished all but the closest corners into darkness. The presence never returned in my bedroom, but the parlor, where the mirror hung, called to me. I began taking my laptop and coffee into the parlor each afternoon, working at the small desk facing the mirror. I told myself I needed the sunlight, the change of scenery. Whenever I glanced up, I'd catch the mirror's surface quivering, like ripples on water. But there was no breeze, no draft through closed windows. Once, my reflection hesitated as I raised a hand. My mirrored arm paused a fraction of a second before moving. I stared. The glass winked at me, and I turned away, heart pounding. By the time I noticed my reflection playing out tiny variations, smiling a touch too late, tilting its head when I stayed still, I was too afraid to leave the parlor. I convinced myself I was losing my mind, that lack of sleep was warping my senses. I started keeping a notebook beside me during the day, jotting down every oddity. Mirrored eyebrows raised 0.3 seconds late. Reflections mug half smile fades. But when I looked back, my scrupulous notes had twisted into jagged scrawls, ink smeared as if someone had rubbed it with damp fingers. The words were wrong, not what I'd written at all. I stopped recording. I stopped smiling at the mirror. At night, I taped over the glass with black trash bags, securing the edges with duct tape in a spiderweb pattern. If the threshold to another world existed, I refused to look. Sleep returned, but dreams clawed at me, visions of water-logged rooms, faces pressed to glass, lips mouthing silent pleas. Every time I woke, I felt the warmth of someone's hand cupping my own, only to find empty sheets. 3 days ago, I came home to find the trash bags torn down. The mirror stood fully revealed, my reflection staring back, pale and unblinking. My heart lurched. I reached out to confirm it was me. My fingers brushed the cool glass, and the reflection did too. But the eyes that stared back were too dark, hollowed, and in them lay a dreadful intelligence. I yanked my hand away and left the room. That night, I dreamed of a door, a low, arched door carved into black marble, set into the floor of the parlor. I knelt and reached for its handle. Cold metal, slick with moisture. As I opened it, tendrils of shadow coiled upward, the mirror's surface rippling like disturbed water. I heard a woman gasp, at last. Then I woke. Bleary-eyed, I stared at the ceiling. Moonlight edged the curtains. My phone read 3:14 a.m. I sat up. Something tugged at me, an urgent tug at my chest, drawing me toward the parlor. I tried to resist, but my feet carried me down the hall. The mirror made no sound as I stepped inside. I flicked on the lamp. The glass was still until it breathed. The surface swooshed, and instead of my reflection, I saw the same frail woman from that first night. Her nightgown hung in strips, skin pale as paper. She smiled sadly, as if relieved. Her eyes flicked down to my hand on the lamp switch, as though recognizing my soul in the motion. My blood went cold. "I'm here," I choked out, voice cracking. "Who are you?" My reflection, or her, tilted her head and pressed her palm to the inside of the glass. I found myself mimicking the movement on the outside. When our hands met at the same point, the glass pulsed as if alive. Vertigo spiraled through me. "I am you," she whispered, though her mouth didn't move. The sound slithered into my mind. "I am what you will become." I stumbled backward. "No, you're not me." Her lips curved into a sad smile. "I am. And I'm here to show you, to prepare you." I laughed, a broken sound. "Prepare me? For what?" She raised her hand, and the mirror darkened beyond the edges, like oil spreading across water. In the depths, I saw scenes from my life, yet they twisted into nightmares. Me at my own funeral, headstone cracked. Me alone in a mansion of mirrors, endlessly hunting a reflection that never matched. Me trapped behind glass, screaming to be let out. Each vision lasted only an instant, but I recognized the faces, the rooms. They were mine, my future. I clamped my hands over my ears to block the whisper of her voice. But the glass creaked, and I heard her chanting as though from a mile away. Slowly, I lowered my hands, unable to resist. The words etched themselves into my mind. Midnight comes. The reflection stays. Break the glass, release the shade. One step across, and you will see a future locked within the mirror's key. I staggered back, vision swimming. A gust of wind rattled the windows, though I was certain they were all closed. Candlelight flickered from the hallway sconce, though none had been lit. The parlor grew cold, breath turning to mist. My reflection smiled. Time is short. I tore myself away and fled down the hall, heart hammering. I barricaded the parlor door with a chair and a heavy side table. Leaning against it, gasping, I tried to steady my nerves. I couldn't think clearly. Half of me wanted to smash the mirror, chip away at it, shatter it into 1,000 glittering shards. The other half knew better. Some doors, once broken, cannot be closed again. I spent yesterday researching. The townhouse had once belonged to a stage magician in the 1920s, rumored to dabble in seances and spirit-binding illusions. Obituaries mentioned that his assistant, or lover, died in a bizarre accident on stage, her body crushed beneath collapsing scenery. Some whispered the magician trapped her soul in his enchanted mirror, glimpses of her silhouette seen by servants in the dead of night. I found a yellowed news clipping in the city archives, a grainy photograph of that very mirror, propped above the fireplace, the assistant's gaunt face white as chalk. By dusk, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the parlor with tools, rubber gloves, a pry bar, industrial cleaner, and blankets. My hands trembled so badly I spilled the can of cleaner across the rug. I almost walked away, but the cleaner ate through the fabric to reveal a faint engraving beneath. A single word carved into the wood paneling under the mirror's ledge. Bind. My jaw dropped. Bind. The word pulsed with power, as if daring me to act. Sweat beaded at my hairline. I gripped the pry bar and knelt. Under the mirror's frame, a slender seam ran between the glass and the wood. If the assistant's soul were bound here, perhaps I could unbind it by reversing the ritual, free her, close the portal, restore balance. But I sensed danger. The reflection had warned me, threatened me. Whatever lived on the other side would not go gently. I pressed the pry bar into the seam and levered gently. The glass creaked, and a face pressed out from within. My face, twisted in anguish, mouth open in a silent scream. I yanked back, nearly toppling over. The reflection's voice echoed. It's begun. I lunged forward, dragging the bar along the edge. The frame snapped free with a crack like a gunshot. I staggered, jarred, my ears ringing. The mirror tilted forward. The assistant's pale hand, fragile as glass itself, slipped from the edge and extended toward me. I froze, tears stinging my eyes. She looked at me with longing. Behind her, the dimensions of the mirror deepened into a yawning void. She whispered, "Help me." I watched her lips form that plea, as mournful as an ocean swell. Everything in me ached to reach out, to touch her cold hand and free her. "I will," I whispered. I knelt and grasped her wrist, pulling gently. The mirror's surface rippled, stretching like liquid silver. I braced myself and tugged harder. Suddenly, a burst of pain shot through my shoulder. I screamed, dropping the pry bar. A web of cracks spidered across the glass. The assistant's eyes widened in shock. My reflection, my proper reflection, the one that looked like me, popped into view at the opposite corner, betraying her by staring at me with tear-filled eyes. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. With a final wrench, the mirror shattered. Shards rained down around me, tipping in slow motion. All at once, the parlor exploded in light. The assistant's hand slipped free. Her body solidified, collapsing to the floor in a heap of pale limbs. I stood, panting, staring at her still form. Then the light winked out. Darkness swallowed the room. I knelt and pressed my palm to her cheek, cold but alive. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, and smiled faintly. "Thank you," she breathed. A tremor shivered through the floorboards. I glanced up. Every shard of glass, every fragment of the mirror was reassembling itself in midair, weaving back into the gilded frame. The wall behind it rippled, like water draining down a sink. In moments, the mirror hung whole again, flawless and silent. The assistant gasped, struggling to sit up. Behind her, the new mirror's surface shimmered, and I saw not her reflection, but mine, pale, hollow-eyed, smiling with relief. My reflection raised its hand, beckoning me closer, and in its dark eyes was the promise, "Your turn next." I scrambled to my feet, shielding the woman's fragile body with my arm. "Go," I whispered. "Just go." She nodded, expression frightened. I helped her to the door, praying she would leave this place forever. As I guided her past the threshold, the air turned thick and cold. I heard her gasp, then the echo of her name whispered in terrible pleasure, "Eleanor." I bolted the front door behind her, flinging the bolt and throwing myself against it as if bracing for an onslaught. Silence followed. Then footsteps. Soft, deliberate on the other side of the wood. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then stilled. I sank to the floor, sliding down until my back hit the door. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought I would burst. I waited until dawn. Then, hands shaking, I crept back to the parlor. The mirror glinted in the early light, perfectly intact. No cracks, no sign of the struggle. On the floor lay the assistant's nightgown, stained and torn, but nothing else. I knelt and pressed my palm to the glass. My reflection stared back, calm, as if mocking me. There was no depth to the surface, no whisper of liquid darkness. It was just glass, untouched, unmarked. And yet I knew it wasn't over. Because somewhere inside that flawless mirror, a piece of me had remained behind, trapped, fractured, destined to become her. I tasted bitterness on my tongue, anger at my own weakness. I had freed her, but at what cost? I left the townhouse that morning and never returned. I donated the antiques, sold the carpets, emptied the attic. I wanted every memory of that place erased. But in hotel rooms and borrowed apartments, I feel its pull. Whenever I wash my hands, blood from a kitchen mishap, a scratch from unloading groceries, I catch a glimpse of movement behind glass. A pair of sorrowful eyes. Maybe it's just a trick of light. Maybe it's my own guilt mirrored back at me. Last night, I dreamed of Eleanor again, standing behind me in a hallway of mirrors, her mouth opening, releasing a howl that filled my chest. I woke gasping, heart pounding, aware of a warm weight at the foot of my bed. My sheets were damp. I flipped on the light, nothing there. Then I caught sight of the bathroom mirror. In it, I saw her, my face, pale and hollow, lips curved in a sad, welcoming smile. I didn't dare move. I watched until the mirror rippled, and she leaned forward, her voice slipping through the glass. "Join me." I closed my eyes, and I heard the click of the door of every mirror in the building unlocking, just for me. I never imagined an alarm could be more terrifying than the silence it shattered. When I first moved into the little brick bungalow at the edge of town, I was charmed by its quaint porch swing and neatly trimmed hedges. Inside, the walls were a pale cream, warm under the sunlit afternoons. I unpacked my life in boxes and hung family photos on the plaster, breathing relief that I'd finally escaped the cramped apartment that had nearly driven me mad. I downloaded a sleep tracker app, setting my phone alarm for 6:30 a.m. each morning. Then I went to bed, confident that at worst I'd wake groggy, hit snooze once or twice, and stumble into the workday. On the third night, something woke me at exactly midnight. My phone vibrated against the nightstand, buzzing like a swarm of flies. I flung an arm out to slap it silent, but when I saw the screen light up with the alarm icon, I froze. The app displayed no scheduled alarm at that hour. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the screen dimmed to black. Silence reclaimed the room. I sat up, heart hammering, scanning the dark corners. I told myself it was a glitch, a stray notification. I sighed, fell back against the pillow, then I heard it. From beneath the bed came a tiny voice, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. "Your time starts now." My skin went cold. I flipped on the bedside lamp, the low glow revealing nothing but my unworn slippers and the dusty crate I'd unpacked earlier and shoved under the frame. The voice dripped from the darkness like syrup. I knelt beside the bed, peered under it, but only the crate, its rough wood grain etched with fading letters I couldn't read in the lamplight. I set the lamp on the floor and reached for the crate handle. My fingers touched cold metal hinges. Whatever was speaking was trapped inside. The next night, I half expected nothing. I lay in bed, half-heartedly setting my phone alarm for midnight just in case. At exactly 12 hours 0 minutes 0 seconds, the app vibrated again, but this time the screen showed no alarm dialed within the next 24 hours. My breath caught. The old-fashioned alarm clock taped to the bottom of the crate ticked up beside me. Its two black hands quivered, then snapped upright at 12. Its bells chimed once, but the sound was hollow, echoing from the crate as though the clock itself were inside. Then the ticking began in my skull, pulsing in time with the clock's backward spin. I ripped the clock free from the crate. Its face was smeared with dust, and the back panel rattled with something loose inside. The hands spun backward, the numbers contorting. I shook it. The ticking slowed, then halted as if frozen. For a moment I heard nothing but my panicked breathing. Then, from the crate, the latch clicked. My entire body froze. I stared at the crate's lid, expecting it to burst open, but it remained shut. The clock's hands jerked back to 12, and the bells chimed twice. "Your time starts now," the voice whispered again, this time so close I felt warm breath on my ankle. I ran to the living room and threw the crate onto the couch. I pressed my ear to the wood. A rasping breath hissed against my skin, and the crate vibrated as if struggling from the inside. My heart felt lodged in my throat. I jabbed at the crate with a screwdriver, pried at the seams, but the wood held fast. Whatever was inside was strong. I backed away until I hit the hall wall, sliding down until I sat on the floor, trembling. I listened as the clock's chime faded into the darkness, and the house fell silent once more. Daylight offered no relief. I stuck a post-it to the crate reading, "Do not open," and taped it shut with duct tape. I considered calling a locksmith, a handyman, anyone to remove the hinges and free whatever was trapped. But I dreaded seeing what might crawl out. I worried that if I freed it, I would be releasing something that sized me up as prey. At work, my coworkers noticed my jittery glances at windows and the way I flinched at sudden noises. I lied that I was having electrical problems. They nodded sympathetically, but never offered help. That evening, I bought a digital voice recorder and left it on the coffee table facing the crate. I set my phone alarm for midnight again. I taped the recorder's playback button, muffling its clicks, and curled up on the couch with the blanket covering my head. At midnight, my phone buzzed. The recorder's little red light blinked on its own before the crate shook violently. The recorder tumbled off the table. papers scattered. I winced at the sound of heavy breathing resonating through the room. The recorder light blinked brighter, then dimmed. When I dared to look, it was silent and still. I pressed stop, unwrapped the tape, and played it back. Static! A high-pitched whine that made my ears ache. Then a whisper. You can't hide. It crackled and warped, then went silent. My blood ran cold. Night after night, the pattern repeated. My phone alarm buzzed at midnight. I jolt awake. The crate rattles. The clock chimes. The voice beckons. I stopped sleeping. My eyes burned, head pounding, but I dared not close them. I emptied the medicine chest of sleeping pills, popped one, hoping to dull my senses. I dreamt of tinny bell chimes and saw faces pressed to the crate slats, pale lips, dead eyes begging to be let out. I woke each time at 11:58 p.m., heart racing, tongue cottony. On the seventh night, I decided to face it. I lined the hallway with lamps so there were no shadows. At precisely 11:50, I crouched before the crate with a crowbar, my phone in one hand, the recorder in the other. The clock under the crate ticked backward in ominous beats. I pried at the lid. The wood cracked. My knuckles whitened. I heard something shift inside. At 11 hours 59 minutes 30 seconds, I yanked the lid free and the crate exploded open. A figure lunged out, colliding with my chest so hard I flew backward. I hit the wall, wind knocked out of me. A woman lay panting on the floor. Her hair was soaked, dripping water onto the rug in little puddles that hissed like steam. Her nightgown clung to her pale skin. Her eyes were wide and panicked. She stared at me, mouth working, but no sound came. Behind her, the crate quivered on the couch, its back panel loose. The old clock perched on top spun furiously, hands at odds. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as the clock's bells rang out in rapid staccato, each chime a stab in my chest. The woman pressed a wet hand to the floorboards, pulling herself upright. She looked at me, fear giving way to pleading. I realized the voice wasn't coming from the crate now. It was coming from her own mouth. My time is up, she croaked. Her voice was an echo, metallic and distant. She staggered toward the front door. I need. She clutched her chest as if her heart had seized. She looked back at me, tears in her eyes, then turned the knob and slipped out into the night. I slammed the door shut, fumbling for the deadbolt. The last thing I heard was her whispered thank you, followed by the click of her footsteps fading away on the porch. I collapsed in the entryway, shaking. The crate lay empty behind the sofa, the clock silent at 12. I thought it over with trembling logic. How had she gotten in? How had she been trapped in wood beneath my bed? I checked the crate, no secret compartments, nothing but rough planks and nails. The recorder lay at my feet. I pressed play. A hollow voice, then her raspy whisper, "Your time starts now." Terror gripped me anew. If her time had ended at midnight, then mine began. I raced to the window, but the street was empty, bathed in yellow lamplight. I tried to call the police, but my phone wouldn't dial out. It buzzed and clicked, then showed no service. I pounded the handset against my palm until the screen cracked, then threw it aside. Sleep was impossible. I moved the crate to the dining room and taped black plastic backs over every window and door. I set chairs and tables in front of them, creating a barricade. I double-checked the locks on the front and back. Then I waited. At 11:45 p.m., I sat in the dark dining room, knees drawn to my chest. I could hear the muffled tick-tock of the clock somewhere, though I knew it had ceased. The house seemed to hold its breath. At 11:58, I felt a breeze brush my cheek, even though every opening was covered. It carried the faintest scent of rain and something metallic, like blood. My ear pressed to the wall. I heard whispers in languages I didn't know, layered and overlapping, rising into a chant. The clock resumed, deep within the walls. Ding, ding, ding. My blood froze. My foot tapped in time. Then the chant crescendoed, followed by a terrible silence. At exactly midnight, a single chime rang out from the wall behind me, so clear I felt it in my spine. Then the door I'd locked from the inside began to rattle shake as though pounded from the other side. The plastic tore. Chairs toppled. The hinges creaked. I bolted from the barricade toward the back door, but the front began to open. Wide-eyed, I ran into the hall where the crate had been, now empty and lifeless. The woman. No, the thing that had worn her skin. Her body lay collapsed on the floorboards in glistening beads of what looked like water and oil. It seemed to dissolve, a pale shape spreading into the wood. The spot where she'd fallen rippled like a disturbed pond. Each chime echoed through my skull, one after another, faster and faster. I heard her voice in my ear, whispered so close I felt warm breath against my neck. Your time. The front door swung open, and a figure stepped through the threshold. My limbs froze. In the dim lamp glow, I recognized the woman, but her face was too long, her limbs too angular. Water dripped from her hair, pooling at her feet. Her eyes were black windows, empty. She smiled, a slow, wet curl of lips. Then she tilted her head and spoke in that rasping whisper. It's time. I screamed, lunged for the back door, and yanked it open. Rain poured in. Lightning flashed across the sky. I didn't stop to notice the thunder or the downpour. I ran onto the lawn, barefoot, dripping, heart pounding like the final toll of a bell. Behind me, the house windows lit up with that backward ticking, hundreds of tiny clocks turning fast, chimes ringing in unison. I didn't look back again. When I reached the road, I flagged a passing car with shaking arms. The driver threw the door open, and I tumbled inside, coughing and sobbing. I pointed back, but the downpour obliterated everything. When I caught my breath, I asked him to drive to anywhere but there. I never went back for my things. The bungalow stands empty now, its windows dark, its clock hands frozen at midnight. Sometimes I see it on my nightly drives home, its porch light flickering like a warning. I've moved 3 times since then, but I still wake at exactly 12, my phone vibrating with an alarm I didn't set. And late at night, when the rain falls hard, I swear I hear the faintest chime echoing through my bones, and a whisper in my ear that says, your time starts now. If you ever find yourself driving alone at night, maybe after a night drinking with friends, getting off work late, or pushing yourself to reach a distant destination, refusing to stop for rest, and suddenly you're on a road that doesn't appear on your GPS or map, unsure how you even got there, you may have unknowingly been selected by 7 Turns Road. Take a deep breath and follow this guide exactly. I've traveled this road myself many times. There is no turning back, no stopping, only forward. First off, you need to understand something. You were chosen, and I have no idea why. There are no rituals, no secret incantations, or hidden routes to memorize. Believe me, I've looked for patterns. I've tried to outsmart it, and I've failed every time. The truth is simple and unsettling. You'll never find 7 Turns Road intentionally. It finds you. At first, it's subtle. After making just 1 turn, your original route blends seamlessly into an endless stretch that feels both familiar and surreal. It doesn't matter where you were originally heading. You'll know with absolute certainty you're truly on 7 Turns Road when the temperature abruptly plummets and roadside signs blur, warp, or become nonsensical, dreamlike symbols, distorted letters, upside-down markers. You'll feel it deep in your gut. Don't fixate on the signs. That's how it tricks you into losing control. You can slow down, even stop briefly. Hell, if panic sets in hard enough, you can step outside for a breath, but never, ever make it a habit. Those who get comfortable leaving their vehicle don't tend to survive. Read carefully, Memorize these steps and accept the reality you've entered. The only path out is straight ahead. Continue along the road. Wherever you started will feel somewhat familiar, yet increasingly distant. Eventually, this stretch will lead you to a second turn. Your car's radio will switch on automatically. Attempts to turn it off or adjust the volume will fail. At first, you'll hear a faint white noise that gradually evolves into a woman's soft muttering, indecipherable gibberish that slowly transforms into coherent words, spilling out your darkest secrets, hidden truths you've told no one. I was terrified the first few times, but keep your eyes glued to the road. Your headlights are your only illumination, and you cannot afford to crash. Ignore the woman and drive until the next turn appears. By the third turn, any lingering familiarity of your surroundings will vanish entirely. A dense, oppressive forest will surge upwards, its thick, tangled branches arching overhead to form an almost suffocating canopy, enclosing you completely. On either side of the road, animals will appear, standing impossibly still, a fox, a squirrel, a bear, a bird, all fixed like grotesque statues. Their empty, hollow eyes will lock onto your every movement, heads slowly pivoting in unnatural synchronization as your vehicle passes. Keep driving. Do not acknowledge them. They aren't animals, not anymore. They're mere husks, puppeteered by the road itself as silent watchers. If curiosity compels you to glance again, and trust me, you shouldn't, you'll notice those husks beginning to distort, melting as if made from wax beneath a relentless flame. First sloughs away in thick, wet clumps, revealing slick, gleaming surfaces beneath, like dark, chitinous exoskeletons. Eyes liquefy, dribbling slowly from their sockets in streams of viscous decay. The forest around you fills with the sickly sound of dripping, the quiet cracks and pops of joints shifting beneath unraveling skin. Eyes forward. Keep your foot steady on the gas. Pretend you don't see them, because I assure you, they see you. At the fourth turn, your fuel gauge will begin to plummet alarmingly fast. Your headlights will flicker intermittently. Remain calm. The road is enticing you to exit your vehicle. Do not. You're safe if you remain inside. Your speedometer will become erratic, but maintain a steady, comfortable speed. The radio's whispering will grow louder, clearer. The woman's voice will narrate every tiny detail of your existence, each blink, heartbeat, every breath you take, even the sweat dripping down your back onto your seat. Pay her no mind. Your focus must remain solely on the road until the next turn. On the fifth turn, a gentle snowfall begins, serene at first, softly coating your car. Normally, it might be calming, but the snow quickly intensifies. You'll notice your hearing fading alongside the thickening snowfall. The harsh wind buffeting your vehicle will abruptly stop. Your engine sounds will disappear, followed by your own panicked breathing. All you'll have left is a faint ringing in your ears. Visibility deteriorates until your headlights barely illuminate the blizzard. This snow goes on endlessly, miles upon miles. Do not look to the sides. Those silent, shadowy silhouettes will crawl toward your slowly moving car, attempting to pry their way inside or distract you into veering off the path. If you panic and leave the road, there's no returning. Some shadows will dash suddenly in front of your car. My advice? Pretend they're not there and keep driving. Eventually, you'll encounter a sign, ever-changing, surreal, similar to those at the first turn. Each glance away alters its appearance, but it signals your sixth turn. Right after passing this shifting sign, turn right immediately. Do not miss it. On the sixth turn, your hearing will gradually return. The relentless snowstorm, which seemed eternal, will abruptly cease, melting away rapidly and leaving you alone on the road. The road itself will deteriorate, becoming rough and worn before shifting into gravel. Your car will shake violently, rattling over every pebble and rock. Soon, these sounds will grow louder, heavier, disturbingly similar to the snapping and breaking of bones beneath your tires. An open field will suddenly stretch out around you, filled with hundreds, perhaps thousands of tall, dark figures. Initially, you might mistake them for dead, leafless trees, but they will begin to slowly, unsteadily move toward your vehicle. The smallest of these entities tower nearly 10 feet, while the largest stretch close to 20. Their elongated forms resemble charred bone fused with twisted bark. They possess smooth, featureless faces and deep, hollow mouths emitting anguished voices, cries, screams, and pleas of those you've loved, lost, or failed. You'll feel an overwhelming urge to stop and help them. Resist it. Accelerate as quickly as possible. The sound of cracking bones beneath your wheels, combined with their sorrowful cries, will make this turn one of the worst you've encountered. While slow, they will inch closer. Speed past them. As you approach the final turn, a profound sense of relief and accomplishment will flood through you. You'll feel as if you've narrowly escaped digestion by something monstrous and spat back out into safety. This turn will be deceptively beautiful, almost rewarding, adorned with climbing roses and vibrant flowers. Euphoria will briefly fill you until your headlights begin to flicker, your dashboard lights flash erratically, and every warning signal activates simultaneously. Your vehicle will abruptly die, coasting to a complete stop. With one final flicker of your headlights, utter darkness, deeper than any you've known, will consume you. This is the final test. The road will determine your fate. Remain inside, silent and still. You'll soon hear tapping and knocking against windows, doors, even beneath your car. Countless entities will circle and inspect your vehicle, breathing heavily and scratching at the exterior. Hold tightly to your steering wheel. Do not brake or attempt to restart your car. Your car will begin shifting as they're pushing it towards something immense. You'll hear shuffling footsteps rapidly retreat, fearful. Then, something massive will open wide. Though invisible in the darkness, you'll sense its enormity. Your car will shift downward, your stomach plummeting as adrenaline floods your veins. A sudden drop will follow. Your vehicle will slowly descend into something terrible, crushing and grinding around you. You'll hear the car being chewed apart, the metal shredding. Sharp edges will puncture through the floor, roof, and sides. Something will scrape your flesh. The vehicle will compress tighter, the roof pressing inches from your face, the sound of destruction deafening. Then, with a final, sickening spin, you'll plummet, spiraling until consciousness fades. You'll awaken gasping on a quiet roadside, the exact place 7 Turns Road first claimed you. Feel the grass, the dirt beneath your fingers. Breathe deeply. You've survived, for now. But surviving once doesn't mean freedom forever. I've traveled this road more times than sanity should allow, and each escape comes at a heavier price. Keep this guide safe, because the road won't forget you. Even as I finish typing this from the supposed safety of my driveway, I look up, and where my house should be stands an endless road stretching onward, signs distorted and beckoning. 7 Turns Road calls me again. I had always felt a comfortable solitude in my old family home, a place full of memories, creaking floorboards, and the subtle hush of age. That late autumn evening, as I sat alone in the living room with only the soft glow of a single lamp to break the darkness, I began to wonder if the quiet was perhaps a little too quiet. The wind outside rattled against the window panes and rain drummed on the roof, but there was something else, a series of faint, deliberate thumps echoing from above. At first, I assumed it was merely the settling of an old house against a chill night. I had spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, and maybe the temperature drop had caused the wood to contract. But as minutes turned to hours, the thumping grew more insistent. Every so often, I would pause mid-sip of my lukewarm tea and strain to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I remembered childhood warnings about the attic. My mother once told me, with a half smile that was meant to gently tease, "Don't ever go up there after dark, dear. Some secrets are better left forgotten." At the time, I'd laughed it off. But now, alone in this vast, creaking house, those old tales of a restless presence lurking among dust and forgotten relics began to feel all too real. I tried to distract myself by flicking through an old photo album. The images of sunlit days and smiling faces did little to quiet the rising tension. Instead, an icy dread crept over me every time I caught a sound, a soft rustling in the ceiling, a scrape as if an object were dragging along the beams. I could almost swear I heard a whisper, indistinct yet laden with a meaning I couldn't fathom. After what felt like an eternity, I stood and approached the narrow doorway that led to the attic. The door, painted a faded pale blue, hung slightly off its hinges. Its peeling paint and age-worn brass handle gave it an aura of melancholy abandonment. I hesitated at its threshold, half expecting to hear something from within, maybe a rasping voice or even the quiet sound of a sob. Instead, there was only silence. I flicked on my cell phone's flashlight and, with trembling hands, pushed open the door. A burst of stale, dust-laden air enveloped me as the old wooden stairs creaked under my weight. I climbed slowly, each step punctuated by the echo of my rising heartbeat. The atmosphere grew thicker the higher I ascended, a mix of despair, hidden grief, and a sense of foreboding that prickled at the back of my neck. At the top of the stairs, I paused at the narrow entryway. The attic revealed itself in weak, spectral light that streamed through a grimy window. Boxes, old furniture shrouded in yellowing sheets, and cobweb trinkets filled the space, each relic a silent witness to the passage of time. Yet, in the far corner of the room, I sensed movement, a dark, indistinct shape that didn't belong among the dusty antiques. I aimed the beam of my phone's light at the shape. For an instant, the darkness receded, and I saw nothing but shadows. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reappeared. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the dim haze near a battered mirror, was a figure as vague as smoke. Its form was human enough, shoulders stooped, head slightly bowed, but its eyes were the most unnerving part. Deep, hollow voids that seemed to blink in and out of existence, as if they were trying to tell me a secret. I froze on the spot, my mind racing. Was this a trick of the light? Had my imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies, finally gotten the better of me? The figure did not move, yet I felt as though its gaze bore into the very soul of my being. Every instinct urged me to run down the stairs, to retreat back to the safety of the living room, but a deeper, inexplicable compulsion held me there. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the stagnant air. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest like a physical burden. I know you." The sound seemed to say, trailing off into a faint wail that mingled with the moan of the wind outside. It wasn't a familiar voice, and it filled me with a primal terror that I had long thought belonged only in nightmares. I wanted to call out, to demand that the presence show itself or speak clearly, but the sound died in my throat. Instead, I stood in that oppressive silence, paralyzed by the intensity of my own fear and the weight of the unknown. In that moment, every creak of the wood and every exhale of the wind sounded like a deliberate message, a coded invitation to confront something buried deep within the house history, or perhaps within my own troubled memories. Gathering every ounce of courage, I stepped forward into the center of the attic. The beam of my light wavered as my hand trembled uncontrollably. I moved closer to the mirror, where the figure seemed most concentrated, and in its reflection I caught a glimpse of something more, a flash of an old photograph pinned crookedly to the wall behind it. I couldn't tell at first, but as I drew near, I recognized it as a portrait of a solemn young woman with sorrowful eyes. A date scrawled at the bottom read 1912. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces began to merge in my mind. My grandmother had once told me stories of a tragic occurrence in this house, a long ago death, a mysterious loss, and a promise that the spirit of the departed would forever roam the upper floors, seeking recognition and closure. Had I unwittingly provoked this specter simply by setting foot in the very place where it once lived? Or was it that the presence had lain dormant, waiting for me, the new occupant, to stir it awake? The atmosphere thickened, and the air grew colder. The figure in the mirror began to shift imperceptibly, its form elongating and contracting as if struggling against some unseen force. I could now distinctly see a pair of lips part in a silent plea, and in that fleeting moment, a torrent of images flooded my mind. Memories of a life before a sudden, inexplicable tragedy, the sound of laughter silenced by sorrow, the echo of footsteps in an empty corridor, and a desperate cry for help that went unanswered. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity toward me. I felt as though it was not merely an image, but a presence, a being desperate to make contact. I took a cautious step back, my entire body trembling as if iced over. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from both nowhere and everywhere, it whispered, "Remember. Please remember." I stared at the words, caught between disbelief and terror. What did it mean? Was it pleading for recognition of a forgotten history, a forgotten name? Was it warning me of a danger that loomed over this place? My mind churned with questions, and each creak of the ancient wood felt like an answer I was too afraid to hear. The oppressive silence broke with a sudden, harsh sound, a loud thump behind me that resounded through the attic like a final, ominous drum. I spun around, heart in my throat, only to see the heavy shadow of a large trunk sliding slightly across the floor. Nothing else moved, yet the echo of that sound reverberated within me. In that charged instant, I recognized that this was not a figment conjured by my overactive mind. It was real. This presence was real. I fumbled with my phone and managed to record a few seconds of what I could only describe as a low, mournful hum that emanated from the very walls of the attic. The sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a dirge for forgotten souls. As the recording continued, I saw the figure gradually recede, melting back into the surrounding gloom as if it had never been there at all. Before I could decide on my next course of action, a clatter upstairs startled me from the recording's trance. The sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and echoing, trailed from above. I glanced toward the only door leading further into the darkness, a narrow doorway that I'd always assumed led only to storage or old bedrooms. Now it pulsed with an eerie, inviting glow. With each beat of my heart, I felt the pull of an unseen force urging me to follow the sound. Against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I moved toward that door. My hand brushed against cold, peeling wallpaper that seemed almost to tremble in anticipation. I pushed the door open slowly, and a new corridor revealed itself, a long, narrow passage lined with faded photographs and dust-covered relics. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until they almost drowned out my own panicked breathing. I forced myself forward, using the beam of my phone to guide my steps. Every door along the corridor was slightly ajar, as though each one carried a secret waiting to be unveiled. At the far end, I discovered a door that was slightly different from the rest. Its surface was smudged with streaks of dark, dried blood. I couldn't tell if it was real or merely the play of shadows, but it filled me with a cold, aching dread. With trembling determination, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room that looked more like a forgotten study than part of the main house. A single, time-worn desk stood in one corner, and above it, on the wall, hung an ornate mirror in an intricately carved frame. The air in that room was even colder than the corridor, and it seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the past. There, at the desk, lay a battered leather journal with yellowed pages. I picked it up, the weight of it sending a shiver down my spine. As I opened the journal, a message was scrawled across the first page in shaky, desperate handwriting. "I am trapped in these walls. Remember me." They took everything: my name, my love, my life. The faded ink and the style of the letters suggested a century-old sorrow, a tragedy that had long been buried. At that moment, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck that made my skin crawl. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The silence was absolute, as if the very air had held its breath. I clutched the journal to my chest, unsure if it was a warning, a plea, or a confession. Then came another whisper, clearer this time, and almost pleading. "Help me." The voice was soft, yet imbued with immense sorrow. It tugged at my very soul as if it were a part of me long forgotten. I stepped forward, unable to resist any longer, and placed a trembling hand on the cold wall. In that contact, I felt a surge of emotions, pain, loss, and an overwhelming loneliness that mirrored my own isolation. It was as if the ghost of that lost soul reached out, desperate for acknowledgement, for someone to remember its existence. For what seemed like hours, I stood there in that small study, oscillating between terror and empathy. The whispers continued intermittently, sometimes a soft murmur, sometimes a desperate cry. I could not tell if they were coming from the walls, the floorboards, or the very air itself. All I knew was that something in this house had been broken long ago, and now the damage was not confined to wood and dust, but to the fragile remnants of human hearts. The storm outside reached a fevered pitch, and lightning illuminated the room in jagged bursts. In one such flash, I saw a glimpse of a face in the mirror above the desk, a face drawn with heartbreak and despair. In that split second, I understood that the specter was not my enemy, but a wounded soul reaching out for release. The diary and the shattered reflections were fragments of a history steeped in forgotten pain, a life that had been taken away by circumstances too terrible to bear. I resolved then to do something. I had to remember. I had to honor the plea of this unseen presence by discovering its story, by piecing together the fragments of a long-forgotten tragedy. I dashed down the corridor back to the living room, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline, and started to search through the house for clues, old letters tucked behind faded wallpaper, photographs hidden under loose floorboards, and even records of local deaths archived in a dusty family cabinet. Every discovery deepened the mystery. I found an old newspaper clipping from 1912 detailing a bitter tragedy. A young woman, known only by her first name, Eleanor, had vanished mysteriously after a scandalous affair within this very house. Rumors had swirled for years, whispers of betrayal, sorrow, and a restless spirit left behind. The journal's writing mirrored the style of those days, and the despair was unmistakable. As the night wore on, I felt the presence drawing nearer. Shadows crept along the walls, and I could sense the ghost's watchful eyes tracking my every move. I began to fear that by delving too deeply, I might awaken forces far beyond my control. Yet, every fiber of my being screamed that I could not abandon Eleanor to the silence of the attic forever. I had to remember her. I had to set her spirit free. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me, the same slow, measured thuds from earlier, echoed again from the staircase. I backed away from the desk, journal in trembling grip, as the sound became nearer, and then paused right at the threshold of the study. My pulse raced, and for a frozen moment, the world seemed to slow. Then, as if in response to my silent plea, the door behind me creaked open. I spun around and caught sight of the ghostly figure emerging from the shadow of the corridor, its hollow eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that cut through the darkness. There was no malice in its gaze, only an overwhelming, unfulfilled longing for recognition and resolution. The figure's voice, now clear as crystal in my mind, murmured, "I'm so tired. Please, help me remember." The plea resonated through me, echoing the quiet sorrow that I had felt in the cold touch against the wall. I whispered in response, "I will not let you fade away. I'll remember, I promise." The specter's form wavered, as though caught between existence and oblivion. I felt an almost tangible weight lifting from the room as the ghost's features softened. For a moment, the oppressive dread eased, replaced by an inexplicable compassion. I reached out toward the figure, but as my fingers neared the ephemeral form, it dissipated like smoke in the wind, leaving only a fading echo of its desperate call. In that silence, I understood that the entity's message was not to instill terror, but to remind me of the human cost of forgotten history. With the journal clutched tight and a determination to uncover Eleanor's truth, I left the attic and returned to the living room. My hands still shook as I sat at the dining table, surrounded by documents and clippings that painted a tragic tapestry of love, betrayal, and loss spanning over a century. The storm raged on outside, but within me, a quiet resolve took root. I spent hours piecing together Eleanor's story from scraps of old records, family anecdotes long buried under time, and the raw confessions of a heartache so deep it echoed in every creak of my home. I learned that she had been silenced by those who feared her scandalous beauty and fierce passion, a woman whose memory was deliberately erased. It seemed the house itself had been complicit in keeping her secret hidden, only now demanding that someone acknowledge the truth. By the time dawn broke, pale light streamed through the windows, and the oppressive atmosphere began to recede. I had gathered enough evidence to honor her memory. I printed out clippings, transcribed parts of the old diary passages, and even made a promise to myself to share her story with anyone who would listen. As I set my things in order, I felt one last, soft whisper brush past my ear, a gentle thank you, or perhaps a plea for forgiveness, echoing in the quiet morning air. Even now, as I write these words in the safety of daylight, I can't shake the lingering presence of that night. I still hear faint footsteps in the attic on stormy evenings. Sometimes I catch myself glancing upward, wondering if Eleanor's gaze still follows me, silently urging me to remember her story, and the haunting truth that every home, every old relic, carries the weight of forgotten souls. I've since moved on and left that house behind, but the memory of that night remains etched into my very being. In our modern lives, we often dismiss the quiet spaces of our past, the dark corners of memory. But sometimes, in the stillness of a stormy night, when the only sound is that of a lonesome heartbeat and the soft thumps from above, we are reminded that everything has a history. And sometimes, what watches from the attic is not here to harm us. It is here to be remembered. I will carry Eleanor's story with me always, as a reminder to honor every lost voice and to listen closely to the whispers in the dark. For in remembering, we might just set the restless souls free, and in doing so, perhaps finally find peace for ourselves. The watching in the attic is my testament to the eerie truth that even in our solitude, the past will always find a way to reach us. And as long as there are secrets hidden in the rafters, someone, somewhere, is watching. I always believed that solitude, when properly embraced, could be a healing balm for the weary soul. After years spent in a bustling apartment filled with constant chatter and clanging traffic, I longed for a quiet retreat, a place where I could finally assemble my thoughts in peace. When I found the old Victorian house at the outskirts of town, its weathered facade and lush, overgrown garden whispered promises of isolation and introspection. The price was modest, almost suspiciously so, yet something in its melancholic charm beckoned me. I moved in with the naive hope that I was finally claiming a sanctuary from the relentless pace of modern life. The first few weeks were blissfully quiet. I reveled in the creaks of the ancient floorboards and the murmuring wind outside the narrow windows. There was, however, an intangible quality to the house, a subtle sense of being observed. At first, I dismissed it as a vestige of my own imagination, or perhaps the residue of past memories. It was only during the long nights, when the world was shrouded in darkness, that I began to notice little details that defied explanation. The faint rustle of paper where there should be nothing, an inexplicable shift in the temperature around me, and most disturbingly, a sealed envelope that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. I discovered the envelope on a particularly stormy evening. The rain had pounded relentlessly against the windows while I sat at my long, scarred desk in the study, drinking a single cup of bitter coffee. The power had flickered earlier, and I had been left with only the dim light of a solitary lamp and the sporadic flash of lightning outside. Between the rhythmic patter of rain and the creaks of the old building, a shape had caught my eye, an envelope, pristine white and untouched by time, lying inexplicably on a bookshelf that had belonged to the previous owner. I distinctly remembered placing every item away in its proper place that afternoon while unpacking. There was no record of an envelope here, nothing that I remembered receiving from anyone. It was addressed to me in elegant, cursive handwriting. The return address was simply marked with an archaic symbol I couldn't decipher. The envelope was sealed with a red wax stamp bearing a mark that looked almost like a family crest or perhaps an unfamiliar emblem of sorrow. My heart pounded in my chest as I held the envelope in trembling hands. Every rational part of my mind urged me to dismiss it as a clerical error or a misdirected piece of mail. But my intuition screamed that there was something far more sinister at play. I placed the envelope on the desk, hesitating before finally peeling back the seal. The flap opened with a soft crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent study, as though it were the opening act to a horrifying performance. Inside the envelope lay a single sheet of paper, its surface covered in fluid, looping handwriting. I read the message slowly, each word echoing in my mind with a haunting resonance. I know your secrets. I see you every day as you walk these halls. I have watched you from the shadows and memorized every detail of your life, even before you arrived here. Beware the mirror, the voices, the footsteps. When you feel that cold on your neck, know that I am near. Do not forget me. The message sent a chill down my spine. I sat frozen, the paper quivering slightly in my grip, as if imbued with a life of its own. I reread the letter multiple times, desperate to ensure that my fatigued eyes had not deceived me. There was something disturbingly intimate in the words, a knowledge of routines, of habits, of moments so private that only an intimate observer could have witnessed them. I began to question every instance of unexplained coincidence that had occurred since moving into the house. Had I truly been alone? Or had someone been lurking in the background, silently observing? That very night, sleep abandoned me. I lay awake in the darkened bedroom, eyes darting nervously around the room as every creak and groan of the old house assumed an ominous meaning. The envelope and its cryptic message played continuously in my mind, each word a refrain that repeated over and over. I wondered, who was watching me? What did they want? And how were they connected to this house, this relic of forgotten days? In the days that followed, I began to meticulously document every unusual occurrence. I set up a small notebook on my bedside table, jotting down every instance that defied mundane explanation, a shadow at the corner of my vision, the sound of soft footsteps in an empty corridor, a whispered phrase that I could not place. I even tried to trace the symbol on the envelope's wax seal by searching through old books and online archives, but nothing I found matched. It was an enigma, a key with no known lock, and it haunted every moment of my waking hours. One afternoon, determined to dispel my growing unease, I decided to retrace my movements from the day I had arrived. I meticulously reviewed every room, every corridor, seeking any sign that someone had been in my house before I did. I even searched the attic and basement, but nothing out of the ordinary appeared. Yet, in every reflective surface, the mirror in the hallway, a dusty photograph in a tarnished frame, I began to suspect that the envelope's promise was true. I saw, for a fraction of a second, impressions of a figure behind me, or a flicker of an eye that wasn't mine. These moments were fleeting, but they planted seeds of terror that grew with each passing day. That evening, as I sat in the study once more, I found myself drawn to the mirror that hung above the fireplace, a large, ornate piece that once belonged to the family that had owned this home before me. Its surface was polished to a sheen, reflecting the candlelight in delicate, wavering patterns. I stared deeply into it, half expecting the reflection to betray some hidden truth. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, I saw a subtle change. My own reflection began to lag ever so slightly, as if trapped behind a pane of glass that was slowly warping. For a moment, the reflection seemed to soften, blurring the features that I had known so well. I blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the delay persisted. Then, in one blink, the image of a small, ghostly face appeared superimposed over mine, a face of a little girl with sorrowful eyes and a faint, pleading expression. I gasped, and for several agonizing seconds, I could not tear my eyes away. The apparition in the mirror was not static. Her expression shifted from pleading to wistful, her eyes silently communicating a story of abandonment and loss. I felt an overwhelming sadness, almost as if I were absorbing her heartbreak. Had she been the one whose absence was alluded to in the letter? The message in the envelope hinted at secrets and forgotten tragedies, and now I wondered if this ghostly child was the key. I reached out with a trembling hand toward the mirror, but as soon as my fingers grazed the glass, the image flickered and vanished, leaving only my own terrified reflection. I sat back, heart pounding, as the room grew oppressively still. Every sound, every whisper of the wind outside, now took on a new, menacing quality, a reminder that something was watching from beyond the veil. I decided then that I could no longer live in a state of constant vigilance and dread. I must discover the truth behind the envelope and the spectral child in the mirror, even if it meant unraveling a mystery best left untouched. I began my search in earnest. Late at night, when the house was swallowed by darkness, I combed through old family records, local archives, and even the brittle pages of the previous owner's diaries that I had found in the attic. I learned that the house had a troubled past, a legacy filled with whispered rumors and unspoken tragedies. According to a faded newspaper article dated 1938, the family that once lived here had lost a beloved daughter under mysterious circumstances. The article was vague, a mere snippet of scandal and heartbreak, but it mentioned a child who had vanished without a trace. Other documents hinted at strange occurrences. Old letters from a grieving mother spoke of the unseen watcher, and a mirror said to hold the secret of her soul. As I pieced together these fragments, a disquieting picture began to form. The envelope's intimate language and the appearance of the ghostly girl in the mirror were inextricably linked to that unspeakable loss. The watchers mentioned in the letters seemed to be a part of the family's lore, a cautionary tale passed down in hushed tones. There were even local legends circulating among elder residents about a child who appeared in mirrors on stormy nights, begging silently to be remembered. I decided to conduct a ritual of remembrance, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. One night, amidst a lashing rainstorm, I arranged the following items on my desk: a single white rose plucked from the overgrown garden, the envelope and its cryptic note, and a small, antique locket I had found tucked away in a drawer that once belonged to the previous owner. I dimmed the lights and lit 3 candles around the mirror. With shaking hands, I recited an old verse I found in one of the diaries, an invocation meant to summon the voice of the forgotten. Spirits of loss and time's embrace, show us the truth in your silent face. Let the whispers of sorrow now be heard. Unseal the secrets in this cold, dark word. For long minutes, nothing happened except the sound of the rain and the steady flicker of the candle flames. Then, the mirror began to ripple as if disturbed by a gentle breeze. Slowly, a face emerged, a face both tender and anguished, that of a little girl whose eyes brimmed with unspoken longing. I felt tears welling up as she stared at me, her gaze heavy with a mix of hope and despair. The room seemed to pulse with the intensity of that silent communication, the air thick with an almost palpable sadness. The apparition's eyes communicated a silent plea. Remember me, I whispered back, voice cracking with emotion. I will. I promise I will remember you. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, the image faded, leaving behind only the trembling candlelight and the echo of my own heartbeat. Yet, that was not the end. In the days that followed, my nights were consumed by bizarre occurrences that defied easy explanation. I discovered new, fresh markings on the walls near the mirror, symbols that I couldn't decipher, but which seemed to radiate sorrow and urgency. At times, I would hear the sound of soft sobbing echoing through the corridors, as if a grieving child wandered the halls in search of her lost memories. Doors that I had long since locked would creak open on their own, and in the quiet of the night, I sometimes caught a glimpse of a tiny handprint on a dusty surface, one that did not belong to any living soul in my household. I began to record these phenomena. Every night, I set up my camera in front of the mirror, hoping to capture even a moment of the spectral girl's presence. Some nights, the footage would show nothing more than my own restlessness, but on others, I saw fleeting images, a pair of eyes glistening in the dim light, a shadow slithering across the glass, a slight movement that defied the ordinary. These records, however imperfect, only deepened my obsession with the mystery of the envelope and the ghost who haunted it. I reached out to local historians and even a paranormal investigator recommended by a friend. Most of them dismissed my findings as natural occurrences in an old house, a combination of settling wood, flickering reflections, and the power of suggestion. But the investigator, a wiry man with deep-set eyes named Mr. Aldridge, listened intently and examined the envelope and my notes with a seriousness that unsettled me further. Sometimes, he said softly, the past refuses to be buried. It finds a way to resurface, demanding recognition. Your envelope and this mirror, it's as if they're vessels for memories that were never allowed to die. His words echoed in my mind for weeks, fueling both my determination and my dread. One night, determined to confront the phenomenon head-on, I set up an elaborate session in the study where the mirror hung. I invited Mr. Aldridge to join me, hoping that together we could coax the truth from the darkened glass. With the room bathed in the unsteady glow of candlelight and the persistent murmur of rain outside, we sat in silence for what seemed like an agonizing eternity. Then, as if on cue, the mirror began to shimmer. Slowly, the image of the little girl reappeared, this time clear and unmistakable. Her eyes met mine, a silent torrent of emotion pouring forth. Mr. Aldridge's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between fascination and horror. The girl's reflection remained fixed for what seemed like hours, conveying a story without uttering a single word. I sensed her profound loneliness and the weight of a tragedy long past. In that moment, I understood that she was not merely a ghost, but the last remnant of a family's broken legacy, a soul abandoned by time and forgotten by the world. She was pleading for someone to acknowledge her existence, to recount the truth of her short, painful life, and to allow her memory to live on. As the session drew to a close, the mirror's image faded once more, leaving us drenched in a silence that felt both heavy and hopeful. Mr. Aldridge and I sat there for a long while, each lost in our own thoughts. I resolved then that I would not allow the memory of this lost soul to vanish into obscurity. I would gather every shred of evidence, every faded record, every whispered rumor regarding the family that once inhabited this house. I would learn her name, her story, and I would tell it to the world. I began a rigorous investigation. Over the ensuing weeks, I scoured local archives, dug through old newspapers, and even approached elderly residents who might recall hints of scandal or tragedy surrounding the house. Slowly, an agonizing narrative emerged. The house had once belonged to a prosperous family whose happiness was shattered by an unspeakable loss. The daughter, a delicate child with an affinity for playing by the mirror, had suffered from a mysterious illness and died abruptly under tragic circumstances. Her mother, overwhelmed by grief, was said to have made desperate attempts to preserve her daughter's memory, endeavors that ultimately led to whispered legends of a cursed mirror and cryptic messages delivered in sealed envelopes. Every new piece of information felt like a key turning in a long unlocked lock, opening a door to hidden truths. I even found a crumbling photograph tucked inside an old book in the local library. A faded image of a young girl in a frilly dress, her eyes mirroring the sorrow I had seen in the mirror. Next to her in the photograph, barely visible, was a woman whose expression was one of profound despair. I was convinced that the photograph was evidence of the family's downfall, a moment captured before the house became haunted by tragedy. Reinvigorated by the pieces of the puzzle, I dedicated myself entirely to preserving and publicizing her story. I started a blog detailing every discovery and every odd experience that I had endured since receiving that ominous envelope. The blog quickly gained a modest following. Others were intrigued by the tale of the haunted mirror, the ghostly child, and the unresolved mystery of the old house. Comments poured in from readers who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena in their own homes, and some even offered to share their own family lore. It was as if my story had tapped into a universal longing to remember the forgotten tragedies of the past. At night, I continued my solitary vigils before the mirror, sometimes leaving a small offering, a white rose, a handwritten note of remembrance, or a locket containing a recent photograph of myself. Each time I would whisper, "I remember you, and I will never let you fade away." And occasionally, the mirror would respond with a flicker, a tear sliding down a spectral cheek, or a brief glimpse of a smile that was both tragic and tender. These moments, though fleeting, filled me with a bittersweet mixture of relief and heartache. I knew that I was merely a vessel now, entrusted with the duty to honor a life that had been brutally cut short. One evening, as autumn bled into winter and the nights became oppressively long, I experienced something that defied explanation even by the standards of my haunted existence. I had finished drafting a detailed account of Lillian's, or rather Isabella's, as the documents revealed her name to be, tragic story, and decided to read it aloud in the study, as if speaking it might anchor her memory in the fabric of the house. I sat before the mirror, the old envelope placed reverently beside my open journal, and began to recite the chronicle of her life, her illness, her untimely death, and the desperate pleas of her mother. My voice shook as I narrated the final, wrenching line. "May you be remembered, now and forever, as you fade from our world." As the last word trembled into silence, the room seemed to pause. The candle flames flickered violently, and in that turbulent moment, the mirror burst into a cascade of light. For what seemed like an eternity in that single heartbeat, I was no longer alone. The reflection transformed into a vivid tableau, a scene from a long-forgotten past. I saw a young girl in a pristine white dress standing in a sunlit garden, surrounded by laughing family members whose joy was palpable and yet tinged with an undercurrent of sorrow. I saw her mother, dressed in mourning, reaching out toward the child with desperate, forlorn eyes. And then I saw fire, a great blaze that consumed everything, the horrific moment of loss captured in slow motion. The figures in the reflection moved with agonizing clarity. I could feel the heat of the flames and the sheer agony of the moment, as if the mirror was not merely showing me a memory, but inviting me to relive an ancient trauma. I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away, as the scene dissolved gradually into darkness. Once the flames faded, the mirror returned to its quiet, haunted state, but something had shifted irrevocably. The encounter confirmed for me that the envelope had not been a mere anomaly, but a deliberate message, a call from the past intended to awaken me to a legacy of loss and unfulfilled promises. I now understood that every flicker of the mirror, every whisper in the dark, was a plea for acknowledgement from those who had been silenced by time. In the weeks and months that followed, I vowed to keep their memories alive. I published my blog and reached out to local media, sharing the tragic history of the house and the spectral evidence that had become intertwined with my life. The response was a mixture of empathy, curiosity, and a touch of skepticism. But mostly, it was a reminder that the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when people are willing to listen. Even now, long after I have left that haunted Victorian house and settled in a quieter part of town, I still receive occasional mail, sealed envelopes with no return address, bearing cryptic messages that echo the original warning. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I find myself gazing into a mirror and catching a glimpse of a tiny face in the reflection, a small, ghostly visage that seems to say, "Remember me." And in those moments, I remind myself of the promise I made on that dark, unforgettable night, that I would never let the silent voices of the past fade into oblivion. The unopened envelope is more than just a chilling account of one person's descent into fear and mystery. It is a testament to the enduring power of memory and the inexplicable forces that bind us to our history. In discovering that envelope and unraveling its secrets, I learned that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. The ghosts of our past linger in the quiet corners of life, waiting for someone to remember, and sometimes that remembrance is the only way to grant them peace. I've always prided myself on being able to enjoy solitude. After years of living with roommates and noisy families, the silence of an empty house was almost a balm to my soul. I had finally moved into a small, old townhouse on the edge of a quiet suburb, a place with creaky wooden floors, long hallways, and a history that whispered through every corner. For the first few weeks, I reveled in the quiet nights and the freedom of having the entire house to myself. But there was something strange about the house. A persistent, unsettling sound that only emerged when the moon was high and the world outside was in deep slumber. I remember that particular night vividly. It was the kind of night that made you wonder if you'd made a mistake leaving the warmth of a crowded apartment for the eerie isolation of an old building. I had just finished reading a book in my favorite recliner when a noise, so subtle at first that I almost dismissed it, caught my attention. It sounded like soft footsteps echoing down the hall. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the house was settling, or maybe the wind had pushed a loose shutter. But as the sound continued, slow, deliberate, and impossibly measured, I couldn't ignore it. I sat motionless, straining to hear any further detail. The sound came again, a gentle, rhythmic thud, followed by another, then the faintest whisper of a creak. I pressed my hand against my chest as a cold dread began to coil in my gut. I recalled the countless nights of silence that had made this house my sanctuary, and now it was as if the quiet had been invaded by a presence I couldn't quite name. Steeling myself, I rose from my chair and crept toward the hallway. I kept my hand on the wall, letting the cold, rough texture ground me as I advanced. Each step was an act of will, a defiance of the growing terror that screamed at me to run. The hallway stretched long and narrow before me, lined with faded wallpaper and pictures of people I'd never met, the previous occupants whose lives were interred in this aged space. With each measured step I took, the sound of the footsteps grew a little louder, as if echoing my own anxiety. As I reached the middle of the hall, I paused. The soft footsteps had halted right outside a closed door at the far end, a door I hadn't paid much attention to since moving in. It was an unassuming door with peeling paint and a tarnished knob that rattled slightly whenever the wind caught it. But tonight, it stood out in a way that pricked my every instinct. Something was behind it, something that didn't belong to the familiar creaks of an old house settling into winter. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were deceiving me in the dark. The house was supposed to be empty, and yet the sound, those footsteps, had a deliberate rhythm that no natural creak could imitate. I squinted at the door, trying to catch any sign of movement through the narrow crack at the bottom. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate thump, as if a heavy object had been set down gently on the floor. My heart began to hammer in my chest, urging me to retreat even as curiosity burrowed into my mind. "Hello?" I whispered, the word trembling as it escaped my lips. I expected an answer, even a slurred, ghostly echo. But the only response was a deep, resonant silence. Yet the silence was not empty. In it, I could almost hear the anticipation, a breath held in waiting, a secret that longed to be told. Not entirely satisfied with my unanswered plea, I took a step closer to the door, running my fingers along the faded brass knob as though it could transfer some warmth or reassurance. The metal was icy in my grip, and for a fleeting moment, I was certain I wasn't alone. In the stillness, the sound of my own heartbeat was deafening, each pulse echoing in the cavernous silence of the corridor. With a final, determined breath, I turned the knob slowly, half expecting it to creak open on its own. The door swung open with a long, mournful groan that sent shivers down my spine. Beyond was a narrow passageway that I had never noticed before, one that branched off from the main corridor and led into a part of the house shrouded in perpetual dusk. A thread of moonlight spilled in from a distant window at the end of the passage, illuminating only the edges of the room. I hesitated at its threshold, wondering if it would be better to ignore the summons altogether, but something compelled me forward. It was as if the footsteps had been guiding me here all along. I stepped into the passage, and the door closed silently behind me. In the low light, I realized that the walls here were different from those in the main corridor. They were adorned with old wallpaper and patterns that seemed strangely familiar, patterns I had seen in an old family album, perhaps belonging to one of the many lives this house had sheltered. Dust danced in the air, illuminated by the weak light, and every step stirred up memories of long-forgotten secrets. As I advanced slowly, my eyes caught the slightest movement at the edge of the light, a shadow, perhaps, that darted behind a rickety wooden door. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding so fiercely I was sure it might burst. I strained to listen for any indication of another presence. Instead, I heard only the soft echo of my own breath and the residual patter of footsteps that had led me this far. I crept forward until I reached a small room at the end of the passage. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned me to peer inside. I pushed it open with trembling fingers, and what I saw made me freeze in place. The room was a forgotten relic, a narrow, cramped space that resembled a storage area or maybe a forgotten study. In the center stood an old wooden chair, its upholstery torn and faded. Scattered around, there were dusty books, faded photographs in ornate frames, and peculiar trinkets whose origins I couldn't decipher. But what caught my attention was a set of fresh footprints on the otherwise thick layer of dust. They were small, almost childlike, but unmistakably human. The footprints started at the door and led toward the far corner of the room, vanishing as if swallowed by shadows. My mind raced with questions. Who had left these footprints? Was it possible that someone else had been here this very night? I had been so careful, locking doors, checking the windows, ensuring that I was alone in this house. And yet, here were these undeniable marks of another presence. I crouched down, tracing the footprints with the tip of my finger. They were fresh, as if the person had been here only minutes ago. A chill spread through me, and I realized that I might not be the sole custodian of this house's secrets after all. I rose slowly, a mixture of dread and determination coursing through me. I could no longer ignore the sounds I had heard for weeks, the footsteps echoing in the hall, the mysterious thuds, and now the traces of someone unseen. Every whisper of sound in this corridor, every faint movement of the shadows seemed to coalesce into a single, haunting truth. I was not alone. I gathered my courage and decided to follow the trail of footprints. At first, the path was clear. They led directly from the small room back into the corridor, toward an area of the house I rarely visited. A narrow hallway that connected the living spaces to a series of closed rooms at the rear. The hallway was even more oppressive than the rest of the house, its walls marked with the remnants of old, scorched wallpaper and the persistent odor of decay that no open window could dispel. The footprints continued, this time appearing more erratic, almost frantic, as if the person had been running. desperate to escape or perhaps to hide from something. As I advanced down the hall, my mind began to conjure up images of horror movies I'd watched in my youth, images of children fleeing unseen terrors in abandoned houses, of spectral figures chasing after the living through dim corridors. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder here, clearer even, and I could swear I heard faint panting mixed in with them. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet an inexplicable curiosity bound my feet to the floor. I passed closed doors whose numbers I didn't remember from a standard house layout. Some were oddly labeled with faded symbols rather than numbers. The further I walked, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the house history pressing in on me. It was as though the walls themselves were imbued with the grief and terror of those who had once inhabited the spaces I now traversed. Then, as I reached the very end of the hallway, I noticed that the door at the far end was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out from the gap, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps, a staccato rhythm that made my skin crawl. I realized with a jolt that the footprints had led me directly here. With hands clenched in trepidation, I approached the door and peered inside. The room beyond was small, almost like a makeshift playroom, but with an atmosphere of profound neglect. In the center of the floor was an old, ornate rug that had once been vibrant with pattern, but was now faded and torn. Near the rug stood a low table cluttered with dusty toys, a porcelain doll with cracked eyes, a set of worn-out crayons, and a framed photograph of a little girl whose smile had long since faded into melancholy. The presence here was palpable. The air felt heavy, as if every lingering regret and every sorrowful memory of the past had accumulated in this very space. I felt a pressure building in my chest. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to unlock a secret that had been hidden for decades. In the far corner, I noticed a small, door-like recess built into the wall. It was nearly concealed by cobwebs and a tattered curtain, but I could see fresh scuff marks on its surface, evidence that someone had recently used it, perhaps in haste. Drawn by a mixture of terror and empathy, I moved closer. My footsteps were soft on the creaking wooden floor as I approached the recess. There was something disturbingly intimate about the marks here, as if someone had been hiding and then suddenly fled in a moment of sheer panic. I reached out and slowly pulled aside the curtain, its fabric soft and threadbare in my trembling hands. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading into a dark, almost suffocating space. I could make out the outline of another passage, one that was not accessible from the main parts of the house. This, I realized, was a secret section, a place the previous occupants had hidden away, perhaps for reasons I could no longer fathom. I hesitated, heart beating erratically, before gathering the resolve to step inside. The air grew colder as I passed through the doorway, and the sound of my own footsteps was muffled by layers of dust and silence. I reached the end of the passage and found myself in a tiny chamber filled with relics of a bygone era. Yellowed letters tied with brittle string, a rusted music box that still managed to produce a faint, melancholic tune when wound, and several faded portraits of individuals who looked as if they had once known unfathomable sorrow. One portrait in particular caught my eye, a woman with eyes that seemed to plead for salvation, her delicate features framed by curls that cascaded like an echo of lost time. On the back of the frame was a date, 1947. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this her? Had she been the one who once walked these halls, leaving footprints that I now followed? The intensity of the moment overwhelmed me, and I nearly collapsed under the weight of the unanswered questions and the haunting beauty of sorrow captured in faded paint. I sat down on a dusty, cold bench in the chamber and listened. The silence here was different. It was heavier, laden with unsaid words and broken promises. In the distance, I could faintly hear a soft murmur, like a voice reading a lullaby from another world. It wasn't a direct conversation, but a series of overlapping whispers, as if multiple souls were trying to share their stories all at once. I couldn't decipher the words, but I caught fragments: lost, forgotten, alone, and please remember. The realization struck me with a mix of horror and compassion. I was witnessing the echo of a profound, unspoken tragedy. The footsteps in the hall, the secret passageways, the hidden chamber, they all formed parts of a vast tapestry of sorrow and neglect. I began to understand that the house was not merely an empty shell, but rather a vessel containing the lingering presences of those who had suffered within its walls. Their traces were embedded in every scuff on the floor, every whisper of sound in the dark, every faded portrait left behind. I rose from the bench, determined to piece together this fragmented history. Clutching one of the yellowed letters in my hand, I tried to read the delicate, spidery handwriting. The letter spoke of heartbreak, of a promise to return that was never fulfilled. It hinted at secrets too dangerous to mention aloud. It mentioned a name repeatedly, Evelyn, and described a night full of regrets and unfinished farewells. I could barely make out the crumbling ink as I read, but the message was clear. Evelyn had been a soul lost in time, yearning for acknowledgement long after she had departed. The realization that I was not just being haunted, but was given a duty to remember those who had been forgotten settled over me like a mantle of bittersweet responsibility. The footsteps, that constant, deliberate cadence echoing in the halls of my home, were not meant to frighten me into isolation. They were a call to remember, a plea for resolution, and a testament to the power of memory. A sudden crash in the distance jolted me from my reverie. I startled and clutched the letter tightly to my chest, my eyes darting to the far end of the passage where darkness swallowed every detail. The sound was unmistakable, a heavy, echoing thud, as if something had been dropped or deliberately set in motion. I couldn't tell if it was a sign of danger or a clue to further unravel this mystery. Hesitantly, I moved toward the direction of the noise. As I stepped back into the narrow corridor, the old wooden floor groaned under my weight. Every step seemed punctuated by a new, disembodied sound, a shuffle of feet, the creak of old hinges, and even, at times, the subtle sigh of air moving through unseen cracks. I followed the path of these clues until I reached a long-forgotten part of the hallway that I hadn't explored before. There, the sound of footsteps was unmistakable, soft at first, then faster, almost hurried. They thumped along a worn-out carpet, echoing against walls decorated with peeling, ghostly wallpaper. I froze. The footsteps had become erratic, as if their owner was trying to escape or hide. In that moment, the silence of the house was shattered by a sudden, sharp cry, a sound that resonated not only in the halls but deep within me. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or a real voice, but it had the quality of anguish, of calling out in desperation. Unable to ignore it, I pressed on, following the trail deeper into the labyrinth of dark corridors. At last, I arrived at a heavy, creaking door marked with a single, weathered number I didn't recognize. It was locked, but there were fresh scratches along its surface, evidence of someone or something desperately trying to force it open from the inside. With trembling fingers, I found an old key on a hook nearby, a key that should not have worked in this modern lock, yet somehow it fit. I inserted it slowly, every click of the tumblers echoing like a countdown. The door swung open with an eerie moan, revealing a spacious room that seemed to defy the rest of the building's decay. Here, a grand hallway stretched out, lined with mirrors that reflected not only my pale, terrified face, but also fleeting images of people who were not there. For a split second, I saw a little girl in a frilly dress, her eyes wide with fear, and a man with sorrow etched into his features, silently pleading. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only a lingering chill. I stepped inside cautiously. The hall was decorated with remnants of past glories. An elegant chandelier that hung precariously from a high ceiling, portraits in gilded frames whose subjects seemed almost to watch my every move, and a thick red carpet that muffled the sound of my footsteps. Yet the most disturbing element was the sound, a series of gentle, measured footsteps that ran alongside mine, as though I were being followed by a silent companion. I reached out to touch one of the mirrors and saw not just my reflection, but the ghostly afterimage of a pair of feet following me behind. The reflection was slow, deliberate, a contrast to my hurried, trembling steps. I gasped and spun around, only to find the corridor empty. My pulse thundered as I realized I was caught in a disorienting interplay between past and present, memory and current terror. The atmosphere in the hall was suffocating, and every breath I took seemed to carry with it a whisper of the lives that had been lost here. I could almost hear fragments of conversation, of arguments and sobbing, as if the very walls were speaking of old tragedies and unfinished business. One particular murmur, a sorrowful cadence, repeated in my ears, "Come back, remember me." It was both a plea and an accusation, a demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge the forgotten souls whose stories were etched into the fabric of this place. I sank to my knees in the center of the hall, overwhelmed by the relentless procession of voices and footsteps that haunted me. The mansion seemed to breathe, its ancient heartbeat resonating in time with mine. I clutched the letter about Evelyn and let tears of both fear and compassion roll down my cheeks. I knew now that the footsteps through the hall were not malignant forces. They were the echoes of lives interrupted, of tragedies that had never been properly mourned. They were a call for remembrance, a desperate bid for closure that I alone was now burdened to answer. Determined not to let these restless echoes fade into the silence once more, I vowed to uncover the stories behind each faded footprint and whispered call. I began scouring the corridors for any scrap of evidence, old diaries, family records, news clippings stuck behind peeling wallpaper. Each discovery deepened the mystery and my connection to this house's tragic past. I found, for example, a brittle newspaper article from 1947 recounting the mysterious disappearance of a young woman named Evelyn, whose beauty and sorrow had captivated those around her until her abrupt vanishing. The article mentioned rumors of betrayal, of a scandal so shattering that her family had concealed everything, even going so far as to erase her memory from public records. As dawn began to edge its way into the hall, casting long, grim shadows across the floor, the echoing footsteps finally subsided. The house, heavy with its secrets, seemed to exhale, a long-held breath released slowly into the chilly morning air. I was left with more questions than answers, but I had learned that the very walls of this home carried the voices of those who needed to be remembered. I now live in a new place, far from that haunted townhouse. But on quiet, stormy nights, I sometimes lie awake wondering if I have truly left the echoes behind. I can still hear those gentle, deliberate footsteps in my mind, the steady, sorrowful cadence that once led me down long, dark corridors in search of lost souls. I carry with me the memory of Evelyn and the countless others whose tragedies whispered through the hall. Their voices remind me that every space, every home, holds stories that insist on being remembered, that even in absolute solitude, the past is never truly gone. I have written down every scrap of evidence, every note and photograph I managed to salvage. I've shared their stories in forums and local history groups, urging others to remember them too. For in the act of remembrance, the cold grip of abandonment loosens, and even the most lonely corridor can become a place of healing and tribute. So if you ever find yourself in an old house, alone in the silence of night, listen carefully to the sounds that echo through the hall. Not every step is meant to instill fear. Some are a plea for remembrance, a call to honor those long past. And when you hear those footsteps, take a moment to pause, to remember. For each echo is a reminder that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. Footsteps through the hall is my account of a night when the past reached out through the darkness, a reminder that every home, no matter how empty it might seem, is haunted by the echoes of lives once lived. I now know that the footsteps were not a threat, but a chorus of lost souls, each urging me, and perhaps you, to remember. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, after I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate. A slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows, far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellowed papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door, all of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained cheeks, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement's secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present, even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The basement's secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. It started with a glimpse. I was tidying up in the dim light of my apartment one chilly autumn evening when I noticed something strange in my bedroom mirror. At first, I assumed it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours at a job that drained every bit of my spirit, and I was hardly surprised when my vision blurred at the edges. But when I looked a second time, I saw that the reflection wasn't quite right. The face looking back wasn't entirely mine. There was a subtle distortion, a flicker of another presence lurking behind the contours of my own expression. That night, as I lay in bed with insomnia tugging at my sanity, I couldn't stop replaying that unnerving vision in my mind. I had inherited the mirror from my grandmother, a beautiful, antique piece with a carved wooden frame that told tales of old-world charm and mystery. It was something I'd always admired in family photos, an heirloom that spoke of generations past. But that night, it seemed less like a cherished relic and more like a window into an alternate reality. The following morning, determined to understand what I'd seen, I sat down in front of the mirror. I adjusted the lighting, fumbled with my phone to record a video, and even tried to gently wipe the glass, half expecting smudges to be the culprit. Yet nothing changed. My reflection appeared perfectly normal for a few seconds. Then, when I paused, I caught a fleeting image of a pale, gaunt face hovering just over my shoulder in the reflection, its eyes dark and sorrowful. I whipped around immediately, heart pounding, yet the room was empty. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held secrets I was not meant to see. Over the next few nights, the odd occurrences escalated. I would catch glimpses of the figure whenever I wasn't paying full attention at the corner of my eye, reflected in a window or in the wavering image of my computer screen. One particularly restless night, I lay awake staring at the mirror. The familiar comfort of my reflection was gone, replaced by a stranger. My eyes met eyes that weren't entirely my own, features that seemed to blur the line between my identity and something unknown. The face in the mirror was intermittently overlaid with faint images, shadows of a long-forgotten sorrow, hints of a life I never lived but somehow recognized. It was as if the mirror held a portal to another existence. I began to research my family history in an attempt to uncover any mention of a cursed heirloom or ghostly phenomena linked to that mirror. My grandmother's journals, yellowed with time, spoke of peculiar dreams and mysterious visitations, but nothing explicit about the mirror itself. Still, she mentioned a vengeful-looking glass in passing, a term that chilled me to the core when I saw it written in her spidery hand. I combed through old letters, searching for any clue that might connect the dots. At times, sleep evaded me for nights on end, replaced with mind-racking anxieties and a persistent feeling of being watched. One evening, overwhelmed by a mix of dread and determination, I decided that confronting this phenomenon head-on was my only option. I set up cameras around my room to monitor every angle of the mirror. The first night of recording was uneventful. The footage showed nothing but my solitary, restless sleep and the ordinary ambience of a quiet apartment. But on the second night, something extraordinary happened. I awoke at 3:17 a.m., heart galloping, to the sound of soft scratching coming from behind the mirror. My eyes struggled to adjust in the darkness as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I shone its beam on the glass, I noticed faint, ghostly traces that looked like handprints scratched into the surface. They were too shallow to be real damage, yet they pulsed with a strange luminosity, as if alive. The following days became a blur of investigation and paranoia. I rewatched the footage repeatedly. In one segment, I saw the mirror's surface ripple as if disturbed by invisible fingers. My own reflection lagged behind my every movement, a slow, eerie delay. In another clip, the camera captured an entire sequence where my reflection's eyes darkened dramatically, and in one frame, I could swear the reflection was not mimicking my movements at all. Instead, it seemed to act independently, its head slowly tilting as though it were surveying me with an intelligence that was not mine. The more I watched, the more I began to believe that my mirror was more than just a piece of antique glass. It had become a conduit for something beyond ordinary comprehension. Sleep became a distant memory. The relentless horror of the mirror plagued my waking hours and taunted my nightmares. I tried to cover it up with a heavy blanket to hide from the unsettling visions it invoked, but that only seemed to worsen my isolation. Every time I removed the covering, the mirror greeted me with the unnerving possibility that something was waiting, something that was not me, but was an echo of me, an alternate version contorted by sorrow and regret. Desperation led me to confide in a close friend, Mark, whose rational mind had always been my anchor. He listened carefully as I described every detail, the inexplicable delays, the ghostly handprints, and the disembodied expressions. Mark suggested that stress and sleep deprivation might be amplifying my imagination, urging me to get help. I attempted to explain that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The evidence on the footage was irrefutable, but his skeptical eyes left me questioning if I was truly losing grip on reality. I began to wonder if I was experiencing a form of psychosis. However, one particular incident shattered that thought completely. One stormy, pitch-black night, I awoke to find the mirror completely dark. Not a trace of my face, nor any reflection of the room, only an impenetrable void. Panic surged through me. I fumbled to turn on all the lights, yet nothing changed. Slowly, as I sat terrified before this endless blackness, a movement caught my eye. From within that void emerged a shadow, a dark, wraith-like shape that approached with a deliberate slowness. It wasn't until the figure was nearly upon me that I saw the faintest glimmer in its eyes. They pulsed with an otherworldly light that made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by the relentless grip of fear. The shadow lingered, examining me with a silent intensity that spoke of centuries of despair. Then, just as silently, it receded back into the darkness, leaving the mirror as empty as if nothing had ever been there. The next morning, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably, I forced myself to confront the mirror once more. I could no longer ignore what I had seen. I began an exhaustive documentation process, scribbling down every detail in a journal, noting the exact times of occurrences, and describing the ghostly features with painstaking precision. I even attempted to capture the moment using different cameras and settings, hoping that technology might offer an explanation. But each attempt only deepened the mystery. The mirror began to change its behavior subtly. On some days, it would show a flicker of a face from behind me. On others, it would seem to swell with a dark energy that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of my heartbeat. One particularly dismal afternoon, while leafing through the margins of my grandmother's old journals, I discovered an entry that chilled me to the core. The entry described a ritual of remembrance, a way for a restless spirit to communicate with the living. It mentioned that if a family heirloom, especially a mirror, did not reflect one's true self, it was because it was absorbing the soul of someone who was lost and yet still tethered to that world. According to the diary, the mirror would gradually reveal the image of the departed if the current occupant paid close attention. I felt as though each word was addressed to me, a warning or perhaps an explanation. Had this mirror been cursed long before it came into my possession? Was it possible that by merely gazing upon it, I was inadvertently inviting a lost soul into my life? The thought both fascinated and terrified me, Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, I began to experiment. I stood before the mirror day after day, trying various rituals I found in the margins of old occult books, lighting candles in a circle around it, reciting spoken affirmations of remembrance, and even leaving objects that belonged to my family as offerings. In the quiet moments after these rituals, I sometimes caught fleeting glances of a face that wasn't mine, a young woman with sorrowful eyes and a faint smile of resignation. Her presence was neither malevolent nor protective. It was as though she existed solely to be acknowledged, to be remembered. As the weeks turned into a blur of sleepless nights and feverish investigations, I found myself becoming increasingly detached from who I had once been. My reflection, or rather the lack of it, became a daily torment. I would stand for hours in front of the mirror, watching as the comforting image of my own face wavered, replaced over and over with that mysterious, spectral visage. There were moments of eerie clarity when I almost believed the mirror was trying to tell me its story, a tale of loss, betrayal, and an unfulfilled promise that stretched back generations. I began to piece together fragments of a tragedy. A young woman named Isabella, whose life had been cut tragically short in a fire that consumed an old estate, leaving behind only whispers and scraps of her spirit trapped within the mirror. One night, emboldened by a sudden surge of determination, I addressed the mirror directly. "Who are you?" I demanded in a trembling voice. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with innumerable unspoken words. Then, in a voice that was not my own, but resonated as if from deep within a forgotten grave, the mirror replied, "I am she you lost. I am the one whose memory you dare not forget." The voice was sorrowful and ancient, echoing off the walls of my mind. It sent a shiver of both fear and pity through me. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks as I whispered back, "I will remember. I promise I will never forget." From that moment, the mirror's behavior changed ever so slightly. While it continued to play tricks on my mind in the dead of night, the spectral images became less erratic. There was a quiet rhythm to them now, a mournful cadence that spoke of deep, unending regret rather than pure malice. I began to understand that the mirror was not a monster to be vanquished. It was a relic filled with memories, a conduit for a lost soul desperate for acknowledgement. In its silent, reflective depths lay the ghost of a life abruptly ended, waiting for someone to listen, to remember, and perhaps to set it free. I dedicated myself to uncovering Isabella's story. I pored over county records, old newspapers, and family letters that had been tucked away in dusty attics. Over months of painstaking research, I assembled a mosaic of her life, a young woman of beauty and passion, whose life had been marred by misfortune, scandal, and ultimately an untimely death in a fire rumored to have been no mere accident. Every clue I unearthed deepened my connection to her, and with every new fact, I felt the mirror's presence grow stronger, more resolute in its silent plea for remembrance. Some nights, as I sat alone in the flickering candlelight, I would feel her presence like a gentle caress, a reminder that Isabella's spirit was now a part of me. I began to see her not as a haunting specter, but as a tragic figure whose story demanded to be told. I created a small scrapbook filled with clippings, personal letters, and carefully transcribed interviews with people who remembered the old estate. I wrote down everything I discovered, and in the quiet spaces between my frantic research and weary sleep, I talked to her as if she were present, a conversation between a solitary soul and one lost in the annals of forgotten time. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like a chorus of mourning voices and rain battered the windows of my apartment, I made one last attempt to commune with the mirror. I arranged the items I had gathered, a faded photograph of Isabella in her youth, a weathered locket that had once belonged to her, and an old letter expressing her final, desperate hopes. I sat before the mirror, now illuminated solely by the erratic dance of lightning outside, and spoke softly. "I have not forgotten you, Isabella. I promise your story will be heard. I will remember you, even if the world has long since cast you aside. For several agonizing minutes, the silence held me captive. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mirror's surface shimmered, and in that fleeting moment, I saw not my own face, but Isabella's. The sorrow in her eyes mingled with a gratitude so palpable it nearly moved me to tears. In that mystical exchange, I felt the crushing weight of decades of neglect and heartache lift ever so slightly. The mirror had served its purpose, not to terrify, but to remind me of the fragility of memory and the importance of bearing witness. And so, as dawn broke over a rain-soaked cityscape, I vowed to honor her legacy. I compiled everything I had learned into a small manuscript, a chronicle of her life and the dark secrets that had bound her to that cursed mirror. I shared her story on forums, in local historical societies, even with acquaintances who had once dismissed my ramblings as mere paranoia. Gradually, her tale began to take on a life of its own, a bittersweet blend of tragedy and remembrance that resonated with all who heard it. Now, years later, I still live with the echo of Isabella's sorrow. The mirror remains in my bedroom, a constant, silent witness to my efforts to remember. And sometimes, on quiet nights, as I lie awake and gaze into its depths, I see her smile, a small, fleeting expression of peace, as if finally freed from the shackles of a tragic past. I know that I carry a responsibility, not just to myself, but to all those lost souls whose stories are bound to the objects we inherit. The mirror that once failed to reflect me now reflects something more, a shared humanity, a connection between past and present, a reminder that in the silent corners of our lives, memory and loss often walk hand in hand. As the seasons change and I grow older, the terror of that mirror has transformed into a profound sense of duty. I have learned that even the most unnerving phenomena can hold within them a message of hope and redemption. Isabella's spirit, once trapped by the cruelty of fate, now lingers as a gentle reminder that we must never forget the stories of those who have been erased by time. In every scratch on the glass, in every fleeting flicker of shadow, there is a whisper urging us to remember, to acknowledge the beauty and tragedy of lives that once burned so brightly. I often wonder if others have experienced similar encounters with heirlooms or artifacts that bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Perhaps, in some quiet attic or forgotten room, there exists another mirror that does not simply reflect one's image, but offers a passage into hidden histories. For me, Isabella's mirror has become a daily meditation, a source of both terror and solace. And as I continue to care for it and keep her story alive through my writing and research, I take comfort in the realization that even in the darkest reflections, there can be light, if only we dare to remember. The mirror that didn't reflect me is my testament to the intricate tapestry of memory, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. In a world that often forgets too quickly, the most haunted mirrors may well be those that hold the faces of the forgotten. And if you ever find yourself facing a mirror that seems not to reflect you at all, pause for a moment, listen to its silent language, and remember that sometimes the past reaches out for acknowledgement in the most unexpected ways. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he'd merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, After I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate, a slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows, far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint, and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellow papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door, all of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained cheeks, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement's secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present, even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The basement's secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. I never imagined that a place dedicated to history and art could harbor such unspeakable horrors. Yet, that is exactly what I found on my second night as a night guard at the Marlow Historical Museum, a sprawling institution housed in an imposing neoclassical building with aging stone walls, soaring ceilings, and halls that wind like a labyrinth of memories. What I witnessed that night defies explanation, and the horror of what I encountered still haunts my every waking moment. It all began like any other shift on a brisk November evening. I had returned to the museum for a second job after losing my previous position in a less reputable security firm. The museum staff assured me that it was merely an institution of art and antiquities, where nothing more supernatural than the occasional dripping water or creaking floorboards occurred. I believed them then, despite my own uneasy gut feeling that suggested something was very, very wrong beneath the polished facade. That night, my tasks were standard: secure the exhibits, monitor the halls, and ensure that all the doors remained locked. However, the museum's layout was different on the historical wing, an area rarely visited by the public. This wing held collections that chronicled local legends, lost civilizations, and mysterious relics with origins that spanned centuries. Rumor had it that some artifacts here carried curses or were linked to tragic pasts, but these were dismissed as tall tales by most. I, however, felt a sense of foreboding every time I passed its heavy oak doors with brass plaques engraved with archaic symbols. At exactly 10:30 p.m., I set out for my first round. I passed through the grand entrance hall, its crystal chandeliers casting quivering reflections onto the polished marble floor. Portraits of long-dead benefactors and founders lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following me as I walked. I muttered a half-hearted greeting to one particularly stern-faced man in a faded waistcoat, but he offered no response, only the unchanging, cold stare of a painted remnant of history. The first exhibit I reached was the Hall of Lost Voices, a collection dedicated to objects said to capture the whispers of those who once lived. Artifacts here included an antique phonograph rumored to record echoes of past conversations, a cracked mirror that many believed showed the face of a deceased relative, and an ancient, ornate key said to unlock memories of long-forgotten souls. I paused at the phonograph display, unable to explain why the air around it felt charged, as if saturated with a secret energy. The brass horn of the machine shone eerily in the dim light, even though it hadn't been turned on in decades. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere in the distance. I checked my watch. It was 10:35 p.m. Assuming it was merely a power adjustment or the building settling, I continued my rounds. I rounded a corner and entered a narrow corridor lined with sealed glass cases containing artifacts of dubious provenance. A rusted, ancient dagger, a set of ceramic figurines with eyes that seemed too lifelike, and a faded tapestry embroidered with symbols I couldn't decipher. The corridor's lighting was unusually dim here, and as I stepped closer to a display of carved stone relics from a remote temple, I noticed that the air grew inexplicably cold. I could see my breath in the pale light, and my skin prickled with an involuntary shudder. Then I heard it, a single, breathy whisper. My heart thumped in my chest as I froze. The whisper was almost imperceptible, as if someone near my ear was saying, "Help me." I spun around, half expecting to see a person, but there was only the empty corridor and the incessant hum of the ancient fluorescent lights above. My rational mind insisted it was my imagination, triggered by the oppressive atmosphere of the museum and the endless hours of solitude. I took a shaky breath and resumed my inspection. A sign on the wall pointed me toward the private archives, a small set of locked rooms at the far end of the wing. This archive was off limits to visitors and meant for the inner circle of museum staff and curators only. Tonight, however, a malfunction in the security system had left the door ajar. I hesitated for only a moment before pulling it open. The air behind the door was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else. I could not quite place it. It smelled faintly metallic and oddly sweet like decaying flowers. Inside the archive, boxes and filing cabinets were arranged meticulously. Among them, I spotted an antique leather-bound journal with its cover embossed in faded gold. Curiosity compelled me to pick it up. It was Harold Marlowe's personal diary, the founder of the museum, a man reputed for his obsession with esoteric knowledge, curses, and the unexplainable. I had heard rumors about his strange experiments and cryptic writings, but reading his first-hand account was something else entirely. The diary detailed late-night experiments, occult rituals performed in secret within the museum's sub-basement, and strange occurrences witnessed by Harold himself. One entry sent shivers down my spine. Dated October 31st, 1978, it read, "Tonight, the veil thins. The voices of those long-lost call from beyond. I must pay heed to their silent cries, for they demand release. The relics speak, if one dares listen." As I flipped through subsequent pages, scribbles in shaky handwriting described events that defied logic, a spectral procession seen in the halls, disembodied figures wandering the corridors, and a ritual in the museum's crypt that ended with a bloodstain on an ancient stone altar bearing a single word: release. I set the journal down with trembling fingers as a sudden noise startled me. It was a deep, resonant thump, like the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in a cavern. The noise came from behind a thick velvet curtain that separated the archive from a small storeroom. With rational caution at war with a primal fear, I walked toward the curtain and pulled it aside. What I saw was a small room that I'd never noticed before. Its walls were lined with tattered posters from long discontinued exhibitions and dominated by a large, dusty mirror. The mirror itself was ornate, framed in carved oak with intricate patterns reminiscent of ancient runes. As I stared into the mirror, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of light, a shape passing behind me, only for the reflection to settle back into normalcy. I rubbed my eyes and backed away. The sound of the footsteps seemed to grow louder, now joined by faint, echoing whispers that sounded just beyond human comprehension. I felt a cold hand of dread grip my heart. Determined to maintain control, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the main corridor, leaving the secret room behind. I resumed my rounds, but every shadow and every unexpected sound now seemed loaded with menace. I passed through the gallery of timeless faces, where portraits and sculptures of historical figures appeared almost lifelike in the flickering light. As I approached a particularly somber sculpture of a long-forgotten monarch, I noticed that the eyes of the stone figure had a subtle gleam, as though tears, or something like them, were welling up. I froze for a moment, feeling that the statue was mourning, before its expression hardened back into its carved stoicism. It wasn't long before I noticed that the museum wasn't as empty as it should be. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, measured, followed my own. I stopped dead in a hallway lined with ancient tapestries depicting battles and legends. The footsteps paused, then resumed, always just out of sight. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My echo was the only answer I received. The sense of being followed grew overwhelming. I turned quickly, but saw only the endless, dusty corridor. The lights overhead buzzed and hummed, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a pale face reflected in the glass of a display cabinet before it vanished. I ducked into a side room, locking the door behind me. In that room were the museum's minor treasures, a collection of coins from lost civilizations, and a series of ivory carvings that depicted mythical creatures. I sat on a worn bench and tried to calm my racing heart. My mind raced through the diary's passages and the strange events of the night. Had I awakened something that had been sleeping here for decades? Perhaps the museum was not simply filled with relics of the past, but with echoes of the old, dark magic that Harold Marlowe had dabbled in. I remembered his repeated insistence about release and wondered if the footsteps I heard were not human at all, but those of an entity bound to the artifacts, waiting for its chance to slip free from its ancient chains. With little choice but to confront whatever was pursuing me, I gathered my nerve and cautiously opened the door. The corridor was in shadow, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning from an approaching storm outside. The air had grown thick, as though time itself had slowed. I crept down the hall, every nerve alert to the rustle of fabric or the whisper of voices. The flickering lights played tricks on my eyes. For one dreadful moment, I saw the image of a small girl in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and pleading, standing in the middle of the corridor. I blinked and she was gone. I reached what I believed was the exit door to the main hall. My hands shook as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt as if it had grown heavy with the weight of years and something else, something intangible and malevolent. I pounded on it, calling out for help, but the silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire building was swallowing my cries. With no other option, I slipped through a side door and found myself in a dim corridor I had never seen before, one that twisted and curved unnaturally, with walls that seemed to pulse with an almost organic texture. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that felt like a cross between a museum atrium and a tomb. At its center, on a marble pedestal, was an enormous, intricately carved sarcophagus. The lid, decorated with strange symbols and figures of anguished faces, was slightly ajar. An icy draft escaped from the gap, carrying with it a faint sound like a chorus of sorrowful, distant cries. I approached the pedestal with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. As I reached out to touch the cold stone, the lid creaked loudly and swung fully open. Inside, instead of a mummy, lay a collection of aged photographs and personal belongings, a life once lived, now abandoned to time. Among the items was a single ornate locket, and when I picked it up, I felt an inexplicable weight settle on my soul. The locket was engraved with the initials HM, and its glass was cracked, reflecting my terrified face back at me. Suddenly, a series of disembodied voices erupted around me, overlapping and indistinct. They spoke in hushed tones, pleas, confessions, and accusations, and all at once, the chamber plunged into complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, activating it just in time to reveal that the pedestal was now surrounded by figures in tattered clothing, their eyes vacant yet filled with unspeakable sorrow. They reached out with skeletal hands, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by a malevolent puppeteer. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the whispers in my ears. One of the figures, an elderly man with a gaunt face and eyes that burned like coals, stepped forward and raised a hand in a trembling gesture that seemed both inviting and horrifying. His mouth opened in a silent scream, a soundless warning that chilled me to the core. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled terror, I turned and fled down the corridor. The voices trailed behind me, rising in intensity until they became a deafening cacophony of dread. I sprinted through twisting hallways that now resembled the inside of a living maze, where doors led to dead ends and windows revealed not the outside world, but other, darker corridors filled with shifting, spectral images. At every turn, I sensed unseen eyes watching, and I swore I felt icy fingers brush against my skin. After what felt like an eternity of running, I found myself back at the main atrium. The storm outside was raging, rain beating against the tall windows, and lightning illuminating the shadows that clung to the museum's walls. I collapsed onto a cold stone bench, gasping for breath, as I struggled to piece together what had happened. The entire museum seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, as though it were a living entity, one that had awoken from a long slumber and was now hungering for release from the confines of its dark history. In the following days, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. I found myself drawn to research the history of the Marlowe Museum and its mysterious founder, Harold Marlowe. I discovered that Harold had been rumored to be involved in occult practices and that he had amassed many cursed relics over his lifetime. Old newspaper clippings spoke of unexplained phenomena within the museum's walls, of lights flickering in empty corridors and voices heard among the exhibits after closing time. There were even accounts from former staff members who, like me, had witnessed figures moving in the darkness. Yet none of these testimonies were ever taken seriously, dismissed as overactive imaginations or the result of isolation. I began to question whether I had merely imagined the terror of that night, or if I had truly glimpsed into something far more ancient and inexplicable. My dreams turned into vivid nightmares, endless corridors stretching into infinity, the sound of ghostly laughter echoing in the void, and that single, sorrowful gaze of the old man from the sarcophagus chamber. I woke up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me home. One evening, unable to bear the torment any longer, I returned to the museum during the day, determined to confront the horror face to face. The museum was closed to the public, and a lone custodian meandered through the galleries as if in a daze. I managed to slip past him and entered the historical wing. The atmosphere was utterly different in daylight. Colors were more vibrant, and the oppressive feeling had lessened, replaced by a mundane sense of antiquity. Yet, as I approached the private archives once again, I felt a familiar coldness creeping over me. In a glass case on display was an old photograph of Harold Marlowe, his eyes intense and unnerving. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a shadowed figure that looked disturbingly similar to the specter I had encountered that night. I stared at it for what seemed like hours, trying to decipher its form, until a sudden movement at the edge of my vision caused me to spin around. For a brief, horrifying moment, I saw a face contorted in pain and malice, and then it was gone. That image seared itself into my mind, a constant reminder of the curse that seemed to infect the very air of the museum. I left the building that afternoon with a heavy heart and a mind racing with unanswered questions. I knew I could no longer work there. The building had become a living nightmare that refused to let go of its dark secrets. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with the history of the museum and the possibility that Harold Marlowe's experiments had opened a door to something beyond our realm, a door that was never meant to be opened. I scoured archives, old newspapers, and online forums, piecing together accounts from other night guards, former employees, and even local residents who claimed that the museum was cursed. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't the first to encounter these horrors, and tragically, I might not be the last. One account, posted on a creepy horror forum, detailed the tragic fate of another security guard who had mysteriously vanished after working a night shift in the same museum decades ago. His friends reported hearing bizarre sounds coming from the museum long after he was gone, and later, when his belongings were found in a storage closet deep within the building, they were covered in an unexplainable layer of dust and dried blood. Other stories recounted the strange phenomenon of exhibits rearranging themselves overnight, the sound of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and even visitors who claimed to have seen figures wandering among the relics during guided tours. I began to notice signs that the building itself might be alive, a pulsing beat echoing from the walls, the creaking floors that seemed to whisper in a language long forgotten. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of my own voice, softly repeating phrases I never knew I'd learned, as though the museum's dark legacy was imprinting itself upon my mind. I tried to resist, tried to forget what I had seen, but the memories were relentless. Now, I write this to warn anyone who might one day find themselves working in, or even visiting the Marlowe Historical Museum. What you witness within its walls may be more than a trick of the light or a figment of an overactive imagination. Some histories are buried so deep that disturbing them unleashes forces far beyond human control. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers is not a mere building filled with artifacts. It is a living repository of sorrow and terror, of unfulfilled cries from the past that claw their way back into the present. If you ever find yourself alone in a dimly lit museum, take heed of every whisper and shadow. Do not let curiosity lead you down dark corridors where time, memory, and fate converge into a twisted nightmare. I have seen the horrors that lie hidden behind the polished exhibits and revered relics, and I know with unyielding certainty that some secrets are best left unspoken. Even now, as I sit in a safe apartment far from that accursed place, I can still feel the museum's presence haunting me. In the dead of night, when the silence is almost suffocating, I sometimes hear faint echoes, disembodied voices reciting Harold Marlowe's desperate words from decades ago. I wonder if the museum's curse has taken root in my soul, doomed to follow me wherever I go. I urge you to be cautious with your own curiosity. What if the next time you find a door left ajar or a corridor that seems to twist into nothingness, you open it and release something that was never meant to leave its eternal prison? The relics may be silent, but the whispers they carry are anything but. I share my story not for fame or pity, but as a testament to the dangers that lurk in the forgotten corners of our past. The Marlowe Museum isn't just a collection of historical items. It's a mausoleum for memories that refuse to die, and every night it awaits the next unwary soul to cross its threshold and awaken the horrors within. Remember this: never trust a place where history seems to breathe, where echoes of the past become voices in the night. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some whispers, once heard, will follow you forever. I write these words as both a confession and a caution. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers continues to haunt my every dream and shadow my every step. I pray that by recounting these horrifying events, I might spare someone else from the same fate and remind you all that some secrets of the past are best left in darkness.